Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin.
I became part of a volunteer search and rescue organization in 2019, driven by a lifelong passion for working with animals. My academic performance never quite reached the heights needed for veterinary school, but joining as a canine handler offered the perfect alternative. As an SNR canine handler with Washington State Wilderness Recovery, I found purpose in the challenging work while forming an extraordinary bond with my partner, a brilliant Australian Shepherd mix named Brody. Each August, our team participated in a week-long retreat in the densely forested mountains near the Cascade Range. The purpose was twofold: strengthen team cohesion and sharpen our technical skills through intensive training exercises. The summer of 2021 marked my third retreat, and despite my growing experience, I remained one of the younger members of our 20-person unit. Our base camp consisted of several large canvas tents arranged in a clearing about 30 miles from the nearest town. The surrounding forest stretched for miles in every direction, ancient pines and massive firs creating a natural cathedral that blocked most sunlight even at midday. During briefings, our coordinator, Mark Jenkins, repeatedly emphasized the treacherous nature of the terrain. Steep ravines, unstable rock formations, and numerous dry creek beds that transformed into deadly torrents during sudden downpours. "Remember," Mark would say during each morning briefing, his weathered face serious beneath his regulation cap, "nature doesn't care about your training or your equipment. One mistake out there can be your last." I didn't know then how prophetic those words would become. The retreat followed a rigid schedule, mornings devoted to technical skills, radio communications, first aid, navigation, while afternoons focused on specialized training. For canine handlers like myself, this meant working extensively with our dogs on tracking, area searches, and in my case, human remains detection. Brody excelled at cadaver work. His focus was remarkable, his detection abilities nearly flawless in controlled settings. What made him special, though, was his communication with me, a series of subtle signals we'd developed over 2 years, of partnership that told me exactly what he was sensing and from which direction. The night before everything changed, I sat around the campfire with several teammates, including Janice Rodriguez, a veteran handler with 15 years' experience who had become something of a mentor to me. The conversation turned, as it often did, to the psychological aspects of our work, how we coped with finding those we couldn't save. "It never gets easier," Janice said, staring into the flames. "But you learn to compartmentalize, focus on the process, not the outcome." I nodded, scratching behind Brody's ears as he lay at my feet. "I keep telling myself it's about bringing closure to families." "That's part of it," Janice agreed. "But remember, the woods themselves are neither good nor evil. They're just indifferent to human suffering. Understanding that is what keeps you sane in this job." Hours later, as I drifted to sleep in my tent with Brody curled at my feet, I had no idea how those words would echo in my mind during the darkest hours to come. The night training exercise began at 9 p.m. on the third day of our retreat. The moon hung thin and sickly in the sky, providing minimal illumination through the dense canopy. Standard protocol required all participants to carry extensive safety equipment, GPS locators, first aid kits, whistles, backup flashlights, and radios set to our emergency channel. Each team consisted of 2 people, and for those of us with canine partners, our dogs. Janice and I formed one such team, with Brody completing our trio. Our assignment seemed straightforward: navigate to 3 predetermined waypoints over rugged terrain, completing specific tasks at each location before returning to base camp by midnight. The evening air carried an unusual heaviness. The typical forest sounds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, seemed muffled, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. Janice noticed it too. "Barometric pressure's dropping," she said, glancing upward through a rare break in the trees. "Storm coming, maybe?" "The forecast was clear," I replied, adjusting my headlamp. She shrugged. Weather predictions mean little in these mountains. They create their own systems. We reached our first waypoint without incident, a small clearing, marked with reflective tape, where we performed a mock evidence collection. The second waypoint presented more challenges, requiring us to navigate down a steep slope using ropes and proper belaying techniques. Throughout both exercises, Brody remained focused and responsive, staying close despite the darkness that would make most animals nervous. It was between the second and third waypoints that everything changed. We were traversing a narrow ridge when Brody's behavior shifted dramatically. His tail lowered, his gait became more deliberate, and he began taking deeper, more purposeful sniffs of the air. To anyone else, these might seem like minor changes, but to me, they were unmistakable. "He's catching something," I told Janice, watching as Brody's movements became increasingly focused. "What kind of alert is he giving you?" she asked, professional curiosity overriding our exercise parameters. "Human remains," I said quietly, recognizing the specific head positioning and breathing pattern Brody displayed when detecting decomposition. "But it's faint. Could be very old, animal remains that are confusing him, or just a false positive." Janice considered this, then gestured toward our planned route. "The third waypoint is just half a mile that way. Protocol says we should document this and continue our assigned course." I hesitated, watching Brody's growing agitation. What if it's not a false positive? What if someone's out here? The odds of stumbling across undiscovered remains during a training exercise are astronomical, she reasoned. But protocol also allows for handler discretion in these situations. After a moment's consideration, she added, "Tell you what, follow Brody's lead for 15 minutes. I'll wait here at our current position. If you find nothing, double back, and we'll continue as planned." I nodded, grateful for her flexibility. 15 minutes, I'll keep radio contact the entire time. "Maintain constant communication," she emphasized, her expression serious in the beam of my headlamp. "Any sign of trouble, any at all, you turn around immediately." "Oh." Clipping Brody's tracking lead to his harness, I gave him the command to work. He immediately pulled forward, heading northeast away from our planned route, deeper into an area of the forest we hadn't yet explored during our training. The terrain grew increasingly difficult, fallen logs, thick undergrowth, and loose shale creating obstacles that slowed our progress. 10 minutes into our detour, I radioed Janice as promised. "Still following the alert. Terrain's getting rough, but Brody's signal is strengthening." 5 more minutes, came her crackling response. "Then head back regardless." "Copy that," I replied, already questioning my decision to pursue this lead. The forest grew denser, the trees pressing closer together as though conspiring to block our path. My headlamp created more shadows than illumination, the beam catching on branches and creating disorienting patterns of light and darkness. The temperature seemed to drop with each step forward, though whether from elevation change or approaching weather, I couldn't tell. Brody continued pulling insistently, his normally placid demeanor replaced by the intense focus he reserved for positive detections. Whatever he sensed, he was convinced of its presence. 4 minutes later, with just 1 minute remaining before our agreed turnaround, the ground beneath my feet changed. The soft forest loam gave way to loose rocks. We had reached the edge of what appeared to be a dry creek bed cutting through the forest floor. Brody's alerts intensified, his body language telling me the scent was stronger here. I keyed my radio. "Janice, we've reached what looks like a seasonal drainage channel. Brody's alerts are definitive now." Static answered me. I tried again, adjusting the radio's position, but received only intermittent fragments of response. The terrain was blocking our signal. "Brody, show me," I commanded, giving him the release phrase that allowed him to lead directly to the source. He pulled forward eagerly, descending into the rocky creek bed. I followed cautiously, playing my flashlight across the uneven surface. The beam caught something reflective about 30 feet ahead, something that didn't belong in these woods. In my focus on that unexpected glint, I failed to notice the shifting ground beneath my feet. The fall happened with horrifying swiftness. One moment I was standing at the edge of the creek bed, and the next, the earth simply gave way. A section of the bank, undermined by previous water flow, collapsed beneath my weight. I plummeted downward, my body tumbling over jagged rocks and exposed roots. The pain came in waves, first the jarring impact of my legs hitting stone, then the sickening crack as my ribs collided with something solid. My head snapped backward, striking a rock with enough force to send bursts of light across my vision. Brody's lead tore from my grasp as momentum carried me further down the slope. When I finally stopped moving, I lay face up at the bottom of what I now realized was not a simple creek bed, but a ravine at least 15 feet deep. The walls rose steeply on either side, composed of loose soil and protruding stone, a natural trap for the unwary. My first conscious action was to assess my injuries, standard procedure ingrained through years of training. Breathing caused sharp stabbing pain in my chest, broken ribs, possibly multiple. Warm wetness matted my hair and trickled down my temple, a head laceration of unknown severity. My left ankle throbbed mercilessly, though I could still move it, suggesting a sprain rather than a fracture. My equipment had scattered during the fall. The headlamp was gone, my backup flashlight had tumbled beyond reach, and my backpack hung precariously from a branch halfway up the ravine wall. Only my radio remained attached to my belt, though whether it was functional remained to be determined. Fighting through waves of pain, I reached for the emergency button on my GPS locator, a critical piece of equipment that would send my coordinates to both base camp and every team member within range. The small red light blinked twice, confirming the distress signal had been transmitted. "Brody," I called out, my voice echoing weakly against the ravine walls. "Brody, come." No answering bark came from my faithful companion. Whether he'd run off in fear or continued following the scent that had led us here, I couldn't tell. The thought of him alone in these woods sent a surge of panic through me, more acute than my physical pain. I attempted to sit up, but the movement sent such intense agony through my chest that I collapsed back against the rocky ground. My breathing came in shallow gasps, the only way to minimize the stabbing sensation with each inhalation. Fishing the radio from my belt, I pressed the transmit button. "This is Handler Wilson. I've fallen into a ravine approximately 15 minutes northeast of Waypoint 2. Injuries sustained. Emergency signal activated. Brody is separated from me. Do you copy?" The radio emitted only static. I tried again, adjusting the channel, but received no response. The ravine's depth and the surrounding terrain were likely blocking transmission. As minutes passed, the initial shock began to wear off, allowing pain to assert its full dominance. The head wound continued bleeding, warm blood trailing down my face and neck. Each breath became a calculated risk, shallow enough to avoid the worst pain, deep enough to prevent lightheadedness from oxygen deprivation. Darkness encircled me completely now. My flashlight lay somewhere beyond reach, its beam pointing uselessly into the forest above. The moon offered minimal illumination, just enough to distinguish the vague outlines of the ravine walls. The forest sound seemed to amplify in my injured state, every rustling leaf, every distant branch crack registering as a potential threat or, more hopefully, approaching rescue. Time passed with excruciating slowness. I called periodically for Brody, hoping he might return and lead rescuers to my location. I tried the radio again every few minutes, each transmission met with the same disheartening static. The temperature continued dropping, the chill seeping through my clothing and into my injured body. Then, nearly 30 minutes after my fall, I heard it. Footsteps approaching along the ravine edge. Relief flooded through me, momentarily overshadowing the pain. "Down here," I called out, my voice strained. "I'm down in the ravine." The footsteps paused, then deliberately moved closer. A moment later, I could make out a silhouette at the ravine's edge, a human figure standing perfectly still, looking down at me. "Thank God," I gasped. "I need medical assistance. I've fallen and have multiple injuries." The figure remained motionless, saying nothing. "Hello?" I called again, confusion mingling with growing unease. "Can you help me? I'm with the search and rescue team." When the response finally came, the voice sent ice through my veins, not because of what was said, but because of how it was said. Low, measured, almost contemplative, with none of the urgency or concern that should accompany finding an injured person. "So you are," the voice said, "lying exactly where so many others have found themselves." The voice didn't belong to anyone on our team. I'd spent enough time with my fellow volunteers to recognize their voices instantly, and this one, male, surprisingly calm, with an unsettling cadence, was entirely unfamiliar. "Please," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need help. I've activated my emergency beacon, but I need immediate assistance." The figure shifted slightly, still remaining at the edge of the ravine. "You found yourself in what the locals call Devil's Gulch," he continued, as though I hadn't spoken at all. "A dry creek bed most of the year, but when the rains come, it transforms into something else entirely." My initial relief at human contact rapidly deteriorated into growing dread. Why wasn't this person helping me? Why were they talking about the location, rather than responding to my obvious distress? "My team will be looking for me," I said, trying to project confidence despite my vulnerable position. "They know my last coordinates." "Perhaps," the voice agreed. "But this ravine creates interesting challenges for radio signals. Very few transmissions make it out. Did you know that 3 hikers died here just last year? Flash floods swept through while they were exploring the bottom, just like you are now." A chill that had nothing to do with the night air spread through me. The casual way he discussed deaths, his complete disregard for my injuries, and his knowledge of local tragedies all combined to set off every internal alarm I possessed. "Look," I said more forcefully, wincing as the effort aggravated my ribs. "I don't know who you are, but I'm seriously injured. I need medical attention, not a history lesson." "Medical attention," he repeated, as though considering a novel concept. "Yes, I suppose broken bones do require professional care. The human body is remarkably fragile, isn't it? One moment walking confidently through the forest, the next lying broken at the bottom of a ravine." The detached, almost clinical tone made my heart race. This wasn't normal behavior. No reasonable person would stand calmly discussing mortality while someone lay injured before them. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I demanded, fear converting rapidly to anger. "Either help me or go get someone who will." The figure took a single step closer to the edge, allowing moonlight to partially illuminate him. Tall, wearing dark clothing, his face obscured by what looked like a hunting cap. "You're not in a position to talk to me like that," he replied, his voice hardening slightly. "Not when you're down there and I'm up here." The implied threat hung in the air between us. I became acutely aware of my absolute vulnerability, injured, trapped with no means of defense or escape. The ravine that had seemed merely an unfortunate accident site now felt like a prison pit, with this stranger as my jailer. "Every year," he continued, his voice dropping to an almost intimate murmur that forced me to strain to hear him. "At least one person dies here, sometimes from falls like yours, but more often from the floods. The water comes so quickly, you see. One moment dry as bone, the next a raging torrent 6 feet deep. No time to climb out, no chance to escape." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, unable to keep the tremor from my voice. "Information should be shared, don't you think? Especially when it's so relevant to one's current situation." He began walking slowly along the edge of the ravine, maintaining his position above me. "The human body can survive remarkable trauma," he continued. "Broken bones, deep lacerations, even significant blood loss. But deprive it of oxygen for just 4 minutes and the brain begins to die. Fascinating, isn't it? How quickly life can end." In that moment, I understood with perfect clarity that this man represented a danger far greater than my injuries. Whether he intended to harm me directly, or simply watch nature finish what it had started, remained unclear. But his presence was a threat, not salvation. Drew breath to scream, a full-throated call for help that would carry through the forest regardless of how much pain it caused my broken ribs, when a familiar sound cut through the night. Brody's distinctive bark, followed by his signature "oh-woo" that he used when tracking. The effect on the stranger was immediate. He stopped his methodical pacing, head turning sharply toward the sound. "Your dog," he said, surprisingly evident in his tone. "How inconvenient." Brody's barking grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by the sound of him crashing through underbrush. He was returning, and he wasn't alone. I could hear multiple sets of footsteps now, accompanied by calls of "Wilson! Do you copy, Wilson?" The stranger took several quick steps back from the ravine's edge. "We'll continue this conversation another time," he said, his voice now hurried. "Unless, of course, the rains come first." With those parting words, he retreated rapidly into the forest, his footsteps fading quickly among the natural sounds of the woods. Less than a minute later, Flashlight beams cut through the darkness above me, and the welcome voices of my teammates replaced the stranger's unsettling monologue. "Help!" I screamed, ignoring the searing pain in my chest. "Down here, help me!" Two beams immediately swung in my direction, illuminating my position at the bottom of the ravine. I recognized the voices of Ben Walsh and Miguel Ortiz, two senior team members. "Wilson." "Jesus, are you okay?" Ben called down, already removing equipment from his pack. "Don't move, we're coming down to you." "There was someone here," I shouted back, desperation making my voice crack. "A man, he was just standing here talking to me, wouldn't help me." Ben and Miguel exchanged glances, visible even from my position below. "Miguel, secure the perimeter," Ben instructed, his voice shifting to the commanding tone used in potential threat situations. "Wilson, we're coming down now. Hold on." As Miguel moved to scan the surrounding area with his high-powered flashlight, Ben expertly deployed a rescue rope and began his controlled descent into the ravine. Brody appeared at the edge, barking anxiously until Miguel gently restrained him with a hand on his harness. "Easy, boy," I heard him murmur. "We'll get your human out." Ben reached me within minutes, his medical training immediately evident as he conducted a rapid assessment of my injuries. Multiple broken ribs, possible concussion, laceration to the scalp, and what looks like a sprained ankle, he reported into his radio. Patient is conscious and alert but showing signs of shock and exposure. He carefully wrapped a thermal blanket around me, then began preparations for extraction. "Wilson, I need to know about this person you say was here. Did they threaten you directly?" "Not exactly," I replied, wincing as he applied pressure to my head wound. "But he talked about people dying here, about floods washing away bodies. He just stood there watching me, refusing to help." Ben's expression hardened. "What did he look like? Could you identify him?" "Tall, dark clothing, some kind of cap." I couldn't see his face clearly. "Miguel," Ben called up to our colleague. "Any sign of anyone else out there?" "Negative," came the response. "But there are fresh boot prints leading away from the ravine edge. Someone was definitely here recently." Ben finished securing my injuries, then contacted base camp to coordinate evacuation. Within 20 minutes, additional team members arrived with a specialized litter designed for vertical rescues. The extraction process was excruciating despite their expertise, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through my damaged ribs. But their professionalism never wavered. As they lifted me from the ravine, I caught sight of Janice standing nearby, her face tight with concern and what looked like guilt. "I should have come looking sooner," she said as they carried me past. "When you didn't return and didn't respond to radio calls." "You followed protocol," I assured her weakly. "If you'd come alone, you might have encountered that man too." The journey back to base camp took nearly 2 hours. Slow, careful movement through the dense forest with regular stops to check my vital signs and adjust pain management. Throughout the ordeal, Brody remained close, occasionally whining softly as though apologizing for leaving me. Base camp had transformed into a medical triage area by the time we arrived. Mark Jenkins, our coordinator, stood talking with 2 local sheriff's deputies, their expressions serious as they took notes. A rural medical technician waited nearby with emergency equipment already prepared. After a preliminary examination confirmed Ben's field assessment, the decision was made to transport me to the regional hospital 30 miles away. As they loaded me into the all-terrain medical transport vehicle, Mark approached. "We're going to find out who was out there," he promised, his normally composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled anger. "The deputies are already organizing a search of the area." "Be careful," I warned him. There was something wrong with that man. The way he talked about death, about watching people die, it wasn't normal. Mark nodded grimly. "Focus on getting better. We'll handle this." The last thing I saw before the transport doors closed was my team gathering around Mark, their faces set with determination as they prepared to search for the stranger who had watched me suffer with such disturbing detachment. The rural medical center confirmed 3 broken ribs, a moderate concussion, a 3-inch scalp laceration requiring 15 stitches, and a severely sprained ankle. The doctor, a woman named Dr. Winters with experience treating search and rescue injuries, delivered the news with professional efficiency. "You're looking at 6 to 8 weeks for the ribs to heal," she explained, reviewing my x-rays. The concussion symptoms should resolve within 2 weeks, but you'll need monitoring for the first 72 hours. When can I return to SAR duties? I asked, already dreading the lengthy recovery. Limited desk work in 4 weeks if you're healing well. Full field duty in 3 months, assuming physical therapy goes as planned. Her expression softened slightly. I understand you had quite an encounter out there beyond your injuries. I nodded, wincing as the movement aggravated my headache. Someone was there watching me, talking about deaths in that ravine like he enjoyed them. Dr. Winters made a note in my chart. The sheriff's deputy mentioned that. They've taken your statement, but they might need additional details once you're feeling stronger. During my 3-day hospital stay, various team members visited regularly. Janice brought Brody to see me briefly, a special arrangement negotiated with hospital administration that brought tears to my eyes when my faithful partner gently rested his head on the edge of my bed, careful not to disturb any of my injuries. Mark Jenkins arrived on my 2nd day, accompanied by Sheriff Deputy Howard. Their expressions told me they had news before they even spoke. We conducted an extensive search of the area. Deputy Howard began, pulling a chair beside my bed. We found the boot prints Mr. Ortiz reported, followed them for about half a mile before they disappeared near a service road that runs along the eastern boundary of the forest. Any idea who he might be? I asked. The deputy and Mark exchanged uncomfortable glances. That's where things get concerning, Mark admitted. We've been coordinating with local authorities about unusual activity in those woods. Deputy Howard nodded. Over the past 3 years, we've had reports of a similar figure encountered by hikers and campers in that general area. Always a male, always at night, always described as behaving inappropriately toward people in distress. Inappropriately how? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Watching, commenting, refusing assistance. The deputy's expression darkened. In 2 cases, lost hikers reported a man who found them, engaged them in disturbing conversations about death and injury, then left without helping. Both described him discussing previous deaths with what they called enthusiasm or fascination. A cold weight settled in my stomach. He knew about the seasonal flooding in that ravine. Called it Devil's Gulch, said people died there every year. Mark leaned forward. That's consistent with the other reports. He seems to have detailed knowledge of the area, particularly places where accidents have occurred. Have there actually been deaths there? I asked. Deputy Howard nodded grimly. 3 confirmed drownings in that ravine over the past decade, all during flash floods. The most recent was 14 months ago, a solo hiker caught in a sudden storm. The implications were disturbing. Was this man simply a macabre storyteller who enjoyed frightening lost hikers, or something more sinister? Could he have been involved in some of those deaths? Not just as an observer, but as a participant? We're taking this very seriously, the deputy assured me, perhaps reading my thoughts. We've increased patrols in that area, and are reviewing all unsolved incidents within a 20-mile radius. After they left, I lay awake despite the pain medication, replaying the encounter in my mind. What disturbed me most wasn't just the stranger's refusal to help. It was the sense that he had been waiting, watching, almost expectant. As though my fall had been an entertainment he'd been anticipating. My physical recovery progressed as expected over the following weeks. The concussion symptoms resolved first, followed by gradual improvement in my ankle mobility. The broken ribs remained painfully present, limiting my movements and requiring careful management during even basic activities. Throughout this period, the investigation into the mysterious stranger continued. I provided a formal statement to the sheriff's department, describing every detail I could recall about his appearance, voice, and the specific things he'd said. A forensic artist worked with me to create a composite sketch, though the darkness and my position in the ravine meant the resulting image lacked detailed facial features. 2 weeks after my return home, Janice visited with news from the team. We've canceled next year's retreat at that location, she informed me, sitting in my living room while Brody lay contentedly between us. Mark and the board made the decision unanimously after what happened to you and the information from the sheriff's department. Have they found anything more about that man? I asked. Janice hesitated, then nodded. They've connected 6 separate incidents over the past 4 years, All involve people who were injured or lost in those woods. All described encountering a man who refused to help and instead talked about deaths and accidents in the area. Just talked? Nothing more? That's the strange part, she said, frowning. In each case, he never actually harmed anyone directly. He found vulnerable people, frightened them with his behavior and statements, then disappeared when help approached. The pattern was deeply unsettling. What kind of person sought out others in distress just to observe their suffering, to talk about death while refusing assistance? There's something else, Janice continued, her expression troubled. 2 of the incidents occurred during our previous retreats. Team members reported briefly seeing someone watching our night exercises from a distance, but when approached, the figure disappeared into the woods. What? Why wasn't this shared with the team? They were considered unconfirmed sightings, possibly just another hiker or hunter in the area. Janice looked genuinely regretful. In retrospect, we should have taken them more seriously. As my physical therapy progressed and I gradually returned to limited duties with the team, the investigation continued without significant breakthroughs. The composite sketch was distributed throughout the region, but no positive identifications emerged. The boot prints yielded a common tread pattern sold widely throughout the northwestern states. 3 months after my fall, I attended my first team meeting since the incident. The atmosphere had changed subtly. More emphasis on buddy systems, stricter adherence to communication protocols, and a noticeable increase in security awareness during field operations. Mark took me aside after the meeting. "How are you really doing?" he asked, his normally stoic demeanor showing genuine concern. And I don't mean physically. I considered the question carefully. "I'm functioning," I said eventually, "but I keep thinking about him, about what might have happened if Brody hadn't returned when he did." Mark nodded, understanding. The psychological impact of experiences like yours can last long after the physical injuries heal. If you need additional time or professional support, "I'm seeing someone," I assured him, referring to the trauma counselor I'd been visiting bi-weekly. "It helps, but what would help more is knowing they found him." "We're not giving up," Mark promised. "The sheriff's department has added those woods to their regular patrol routes, and they're re-examining several unsolved missing persons cases from the area." "Missing persons? You think he might have—" Mark cut me off gently. "We don't know anything definitively, but given his behavior and apparent knowledge of deaths in the area, they're exploring all possibilities." I returned to field operations the following month, with Brody seemingly as eager as I was to resume our work. Our first assignment was deliberately routine, a training exercise in an open area near the city, far from the dense forests where I'd encountered the stranger. Despite the controlled environment, I found myself scanning tree lines, startling at unexpected sounds, and keeping Brody closer than protocol strictly required. My team members noticed but said nothing, their understanding unspoken but appreciated. 2 years have passed since that night in the ravine. My physical injuries have long since healed, leaving only occasional twinges in my ribs during cold weather as reminders. The psychological impact has proven more persistent, manifesting in heightened situational awareness during operations and occasional nightmares, featuring a shadowy figure standing above me, watching with detached curiosity. Our search and rescue team implemented permanent changes following my encounter. Night exercises now require minimum groups of 4 rather than 2. GPS trackers include backup satellite capabilities to overcome terrain interference. Most significantly, we relocated our annual retreat to a different forest system entirely, one with better cellular coverage and closer proximity to emergency services. The identity of the man who found me that night remains unknown. Despite coordinated efforts between multiple law enforcement agencies, no arrests have been made, and no definitive suspect identified. The composite sketch hangs in several ranger stations throughout the region, alongside safety advisories warning hikers to travel in groups and report any unusual encounters immediately. Last summer, a family of hikers reported being approached by a man matching the description while setting up camp near the ravine where I fell. He reportedly stood at the edge of their campsite, commenting on how dangerous the area could be for children, before melting back into the forest when the father confronted him. Rangers searched the area but found no evidence of his presence beyond a single boot print preserved in mud near a creek crossing. Brody and I continue our work with the search and rescue team, though we now specialize in urban operations rather than wilderness searches. He's approaching retirement age for working dogs, his muzzle showing the first hints of gray, but his detection abilities remain exceptional. Sometimes I catch him staring into dense underbrush during training exercises, his posture alert and wary in a way it never was before our encounter. I've come to believe that the forests conceal more than just natural dangers. They harbor human predators too, individuals who find satisfaction in the vulnerability of others, who position themselves to witness suffering without intervention. Whether the man I encountered that night was simply a disturbed individual with macabre interests or something more actively malevolent remains uncertain. What I know with absolute certainty is this: when I train new handlers now, I emphasize that our greatest asset isn't our technical equipment or even our highly trained dogs. It's our connection to other team members. The knowledge that no matter how remote the location or how dire the circumstances, we never truly operate alone. And when I find myself in the woods after sunset, I keep my flashlight trained not just on the path ahead, but occasionally behind me and above, scanning the darkness for silhouettes that have no reason to be there, listening for footsteps that approach when help has not been called. Because somewhere in the forests of Washington, a man wanders in darkness seeking those in distress not to rescue them, but to witness their fear. And until he's found, my vigilance remains as much a part of my equipment as my compass, my radio, or my first aid kit. The shadows in those woods hide more than fallen branches and wildlife. They conceal watching eyes that find pleasure in pain and voice that whisper of death with inappropriate intimacy. They harbor a presence that waits for mistakes, for falls, for moments of vulnerability, not to help, but to observe. And sometimes, on nights when the wind carries voices from deeper in the forest, I wonder how many of those who went missing in those woods over the years encountered him first, standing above them, discussing their fate with clinical detachment while the life slowly ebbed from their bodies. I wonder, too, if he watches our team from afar, learning our protocols, studying our search patterns, waiting for another opportunity to find one of us alone and vulnerable. The thought keeps me alert during every operation, my senses attuned to presences that don't belong. Because in my line of work, I've learned that not all predators walk on four legs. Some stand upright, wear hiking boots, and take pleasure in finding you at your weakest moment, not to offer salvation, but to savor your desperation before disappearing back into the shadows that spawned them. It started with a simple suggestion, as most life-altering experiences do. This happened back in 2020, when life still felt somewhat normal despite everything going on in the world. My girlfriend Isabella and I had been dating for about 2 years at that point, living together in a cramped downtown apartment that felt increasingly claustrophobic as pandemic restrictions forced us to spend more time indoors. "I think we need to get out of the city," Isabella said one evening as we sat on our small balcony, the only outdoor space we had. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun and she looked tired, we both were. "Maybe go camping for a weekend." The suggestion caught me off guard. I'd never been much of an outdoorsman. Growing up in suburban neighborhoods with parents who considered a hotel with no room service to be roughing it, my camping experience was limited to a few awkward Boy Scout outings in middle school and one disastrous trip with my college roommate that ended with a midnight drive home in the rain. "Camping? Really?" I asked, not bothering to hide my skepticism. Isabella's eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months. "Yes, my family used to go every summer when I was a kid. It was the highlight of my year." She leaned forward, already animated by the idea. "Just think about it. Fresh air, no neighbors, no constant sirens, no delivery people knocking on our door. Just us and nature." When she put it that way, I had to admit it sounded appealing. Our apartment walls had grown thin during quarantine, and the constant noise of urban living had become a persistent irritant rather than the ambient backdrop it once was. "I don't have any gear," I offered weakly, already sensing I was fighting a losing battle against her enthusiasm. "We can buy what we need. I've been saving some money anyway." Isabella pulled out her laptop and began showing me images of serene campsites, pristine lakes, and towering forests. "There's this perfect spot about 3 hours north. It's remote enough to be peaceful, but not so far that it's a hassle to get to. I studied her face as she scrolled through photos. Isabella had always been the adventurous one in our relationship, the one who suggested spontaneous road trips, who insisted we try the new Ethiopian restaurant instead of our usual pizza place, who once dragged me to an underground jazz club that became my favorite spot in the city. Her spirit was one of the things I loved most about her, and seeing that spark again after months of pandemic-induced monotony was like watching a flickering light grow stronger. "Okay," I said finally. "Let's do it." Isabella's smile was worth whatever discomfort I might endure sleeping on the ground. She threw her arms around my neck and kissed me, then immediately began making lists of supplies we would need. I watched her, feeling a mixture of affection and apprehension. Neither of us could have known then what awaited us in those woods. The next few days were a flurry of preparation. Isabella approached the camping trip with the tactical precision of a military operation. She researched campsites, checked weather forecasts, and created detailed packing lists. I mostly nodded along, offering occasional input but generally trusting her greater experience in these matters. "We need a good tent," she declared as we browsed an outdoor supply store, one of the few retail establishments open with capacity restrictions. "This one looks perfect." She pointed to a forest green tent that seemed unnecessarily large to me. "Isn't that too big for just the two of us?" I asked, eyeing the price tag with some alarm. "Trust me, you'll appreciate the extra space," she said. "Plus, look, it has these mesh windows." She gestured to small rectangular cutouts covered with fine mesh. "You can see the stars at night, and the sunrise will wake us naturally in the morning." Something about those windows bothered me, though I couldn't have explained why at the time. They seemed like eyes, I suppose, ways for the outside to look in as much as for us to look out. But I dismissed the thought as irrational and agreed to the purchase. By Thursday evening, our living room was filled with camping equipment. The tent, 2 sleeping bags rated for cool weather, a portable camp stove, waterproof matches, flashlights, a first aid kit, and enough trail mix to feed a small army. Isabella had thought of everything. "Are you excited?" she asked as we loaded the car Friday morning. The rising sun bathing the city in a golden glow that made even the grimiest buildings look momentarily beautiful. "I'm cautiously optimistic," I replied, which made her laugh. As we pulled away from our apartment building, I felt the weight of urban living begin to lift from my shoulders. Ahead lay forests, open skies, and quiet, just us and nature as Isabella had promised. Looking back now, I wish we had stayed in our cramped apartment, with its thin walls and constant noise. I wish we had never discovered what waited for us in those woods. The drive north took us through gradually changing landscapes. The dense urban sprawl gave way to suburbs, then to small towns with quaint main streets, and finally to the rolling countryside dotted with farms and the occasional gas station. Isabella had created a playlist for the trip, and we alternated between singing along to familiar songs and comfortable silence. "You know, my dad used to say that camping shows you who people really are," Isabella said as we turned onto a state highway that would take us to our destination. "Strip away modern conveniences and personalities become clearer." "That sounds ominous," I replied. "What if you discover I'm secretly terrible once I've been deprived of indoor plumbing?" She laughed and squeezed my knee. "I already know who you are. I'm not worried." Her confidence warmed me, though I wondered if it was misplaced. I had never considered myself particularly resourceful or outdoorsy. At 32, I had built a comfortable life around routine and convenience, a stable job in graphic design that I could do remotely, a social circle that rarely ventured beyond familiar restaurants and bars, a relationship with a woman who somehow saw more in me than I sometimes saw in myself. As we continued driving, the roads narrowed and the forest grew denser on either side. Pine, oak, and maple trees crowded together, their branches creating a canopy that dappled the sunlight across the asphalt. The radio signal began to weaken, interrupted by static that eventually prompted Isabella to turn it off altogether. "We're really getting away from it all," she said with satisfaction. The final turn took us onto a gravel road that rattled the car and sent dust billowing behind us. After about 15 minutes of slow driving, we reached a small clearing with a wooden sign marking the entrance to the campground, if it could even be called that. Unlike the organized campgrounds I had envisioned, with designated sites and common facilities, this appeared to be little more than a series of clearings scattered throughout the woods, connected by crude paths. "This is it?" I asked, unable to keep the apprehension from my voice. Isabella nodded enthusiastically. Isn't it perfect? My friend Jade came here last summer. She said we'd have complete privacy. The word privacy took on a sinister double meaning as I surveyed our surroundings. The forest seemed to watch us, the trees standing like silent sentinels as we unloaded our equipment. The air was cooler here, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, its cry echoing through the trees before fading into silence. We chose a clearing about 100 yards from where we had parked. It was roughly circular, with soft ground covered in pine needles and a natural stone formation that would serve as a windbreak. The site was bordered by dense forest on 3 sides, with a slight opening to the east that Isabella noted would give us a view of the sunrise. Setting up camp proved more challenging than I had anticipated. The tent, which had looked so straightforward in the store, became a puzzle of poles and canvas that Isabella eventually took charge of assembling. I focused instead on gathering wood for a fire, staying within sight of our clearing but venturing just far enough into the trees to find suitable branches. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Several times I turned suddenly, expecting to catch someone or something observing me from the shadows between the trees. Each time I saw nothing but more forest stretching in every direction. You're just not used to so much quiet, I muttered to myself, bending to pick up a fallen branch. The crack of a twig somewhere behind me made me straighten up quickly, my heart racing. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish even as I did so. No response came, of course. Just the whisper of wind through the pine needles and the occasional call of a distant bird. I gathered the wood I had collected and hurried back to the clearing, where Isabella had successfully erected our tent. "What do you think?" she asked proudly, gesturing to the forest green structure that would be our home for the next 2 nights. "It looks great," I said, dropping the wood and trying to shake off my unease. "Professional-grade tent construction. I told you those Girl Scout badges would come in handy someday," she teased. She must have noticed something in my expression because her smile faltered. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, not wanting to dampen her enthusiasm with what were surely just city-dweller jitters. "Yeah, all good. Just getting used to being surrounded by so much nature." Isabella laughed. "That's the whole point. Come on, help me unpack the sleeping bags." The rest of the afternoon passed pleasantly enough. We arranged our campsite, prepared a simple meal on the portable stove, and talked about everything and nothing as the daylight gradually faded. By the time we had a fire going, night had fallen completely, and the forest around us had transformed into an impenetrable wall of darkness. The flames cast dancing shadows across our clearing, creating an illusion of movement just beyond the circle of light. Above us, stars emerged in a dazzling display that made me momentarily forget my unease. In the city, light pollution obscured all but the brightest celestial bodies, but here, the night sky revealed itself in all its glory. "Worth the trip just for this view," I said, leaning back in my folding chair and staring upward. Isabella nodded, her face golden in the firelight. "I told you, nothing compares to this." As the fire burned down to embers, we prepared for sleep. The temperature had dropped considerably, and I was grateful for the thermal sleeping bags Isabella had insisted on purchasing. Inside the tent, she set up a small battery-powered lantern that cast a soft glow across the interior. "Which side do you want?" she asked, arranging the sleeping bags side by side on the tent floor. "I'll take the one by the window," I said, surprising myself. Despite my earlier misgivings about the mesh openings, I now found myself drawn to them, perhaps wanting to keep an eye on the darkness outside rather than turning my back to it. Isabella kissed me softly before sliding into her sleeping bag. "Sleep well. Tomorrow we'll explore properly." I nodded, settling into my own bag and turning toward the small rectangular window near my head. Through it, I could see a patch of star-filled sky and the silhouettes of tree branches swaying gently in the night breeze. The sight was both beautiful and somehow unsettling. As Isabella's breathing deepened beside me, I continued to stare out the window, watching the patterns of stars and shadows. Just as my eyelids began to grow heavy, something moved across my field of vision, too quick and deliberate to be a branch in the wind. I blinked, suddenly alert, and stared harder into the darkness. Nothing moved. The forest outside was still, The only sound, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. I must have imagined it, I told myself. A trick of shadows and sleepiness. Eventually, exhaustion overcame vigilance, and I drifted into uneasy sleep, unaware that our presence in these woods had already been noticed. Morning arrived in a flood of golden light that poured through the tent's mesh windows, just as Isabella had predicted. For a moment, disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings, I forgot where I was. The firm ground beneath my sleeping bag, the soft rustle of nylon as I shifted position, the crisp scent of pine filtering through the tent. All of it seemed alien until memory reasserted itself. Camping. We were camping. Isabella was already awake, her sleeping bag empty beside me. The sound of her humming drifted through the tent walls, along with the aromatic promise of coffee brewing. I stretched, surprised to find that I'd slept relatively well despite my unease the previous evening. The daylight had chased away the shadows, and with them, my nebulous fears. Emerging from the tent, I found Isabella crouched beside our small camp stove, where a battered tin pot steamed with what smelled like remarkably decent coffee. "Morning, sleepyhead," she said, glancing up with a smile that made the whole uncomfortable sleeping arrangement worthwhile. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and despite the primitive conditions, she somehow looked refreshed and vibrant. "Coffee's almost ready." The clearing looked different in daylight. Smaller, less mysterious, more inviting. Sunlight filtered through the canopy overhead, creating patterns of light and shadow on the ground. Birds called to one another from the trees, their songs forming a natural symphony that filled the air. "Sleep okay?" Isabella asked, pouring the coffee into 2 enamel mugs. "Better than I expected," I admitted, accepting one of the mugs gratefully. "How about you?" "Like a rock. There's something about fresh air that knocks me right out." She gestured toward a paper map spread out on one of our folding chairs. "I was thinking we could hike to the lake this morning. It's about 2 miles from here and supposedly beautiful." The idea of venturing deeper into the forest triggered a momentary hesitation that I quickly suppressed. There was nothing to fear in these woods, at least nothing rational. My unease was simply the natural discomfort of someone accustomed to city life suddenly placed in a wilderness setting. "Sounds great," I said, sipping my coffee and moving to examine the map. After a breakfast of instant oatmeal fortified with dried fruits and nuts, we prepared for our hike. Isabella insisted we take precautions, packing water bottles, energy bars, a small first aid kit, and a whistle in a lightweight backpack that I volunteered to carry. She also brought along a compass and the map, though she assured me the trail to the lake was well marked and frequently traveled. "Have you seen anyone else since we got here?" I asked as we secured our campsite, making sure the fire was completely extinguished and our food stored in the car to avoid attracting wildlife. Isabella paused, considering. "No, now that you mention it, but it's early in the season, and this place is pretty off the beaten path. That's what makes it special." The trail began just beyond our clearing, a narrow path marked by blue blazes painted on tree trunks at irregular intervals. It wound through the forest, sometimes visible for several yards ahead, other times seeming to disappear into the underbrush before revealing itself again. The ground beneath our feet was soft with decades of fallen leaves and pine needles, occasionally interrupted by exposed roots or small rocky outcroppings that required careful navigation. As we walked, Isabella pointed out various plants and birds, surprising me with her knowledge of forest ecology. Her father, it turned out, had been an amateur naturalist who had passed on his passion to his daughter during their family camping trips. "That's a scarlet tanager," she said, pointing to a flash of brilliant red among the green leaves overhead. "They winter in South America and come back here to breed in the summer." "How do you remember all this?" I asked, impressed. She shrugged, smiling. "Some kids memorized baseball stats. I memorized bird migrations and plant identifications." The trail gradually sloped upward, becoming steeper and more challenging as we progressed. Despite the cool morning air, I found myself sweating with the exertion. Isabella moved ahead of me, her steps sure and practiced on the uneven terrain. "Almost there," she called back encouragingly as we crested a small ridge. And then, suddenly the trees opened up to reveal the lake, a vast, glittering expanse of water surrounded by dense forest on all sides. The sunlight danced across its surface, creating a dazzling display of light that momentarily blinded me. As my eyes adjusted, I took in the scene. The deep blue water contrasting with the vibrant green of the surrounding pines. The small rocky beach that provided access to the shoreline. The perfect stillness broken only by the occasional ripple when a fish surfaced. "Wow," I said inadequately. Isabella beamed, clearly pleased by my reaction. "I told you it would be worth the hike." We spent several hours at the lake, alternating between exploring the shoreline and simply sitting on the rocks, enjoying the tranquility. Isabella ventured into the water briefly, declaring it refreshing, which I interpreted as numbingly cold, and declined to join her. Instead, I took photographs with my phone, though the images couldn't possibly capture the vastness and beauty of the place. As midday approached, we shared the sandwiches and fruit we had packed, sitting side by side on a sun-warmed boulder at the water's edge. The solitude was complete. We hadn't encountered another person on the trail or at the lake, reinforcing the sense that we had this wilderness entirely to ourselves. "Hard to believe we're only a few hours from the city," I commented, watching an osprey circle lazily above the water. Isabella nodded, leaning against my shoulder. "It's like another world." The comment triggered a memory of something I had seen or thought I had seen the previous night. That quick movement outside our tent window. I considered mentioning it, but decided against it. The moment was too perfect to disturb with vague nocturnal anxieties. We began our return journey in the early afternoon, retracing our steps along the blue-blazed trail. The forest seemed different somehow on the return trip, more closed in, the shadows deeper despite the sun still being high in the sky. I found myself scanning the trees more frequently, unable to shake the feeling that eyes were following our progress. "Do you ever feel like you're being watched in the woods?" I asked Isabella as we navigated a particularly dense section of the trail. She glanced at me curiously. "Sometimes. It's natural, I think. Humans evolved to be wary in forests, too many places for predators to hide." Her rational explanation should have comforted me, but instead, it heightened my awareness of our vulnerability. We were indeed isolated here, far from help if anything went wrong. The trail suddenly seemed less like a path and more like a trap, leading us deeper into territory we didn't understand. "Hey," Isabella said, touching my arm. She had stopped walking and was looking at me with concern. "Are you okay?" "You look pale." I forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just tired, I guess. Not used to all this hiking." She studied me for a moment longer, then nodded, though she didn't seem entirely convinced. "We're almost back. Maybe you should rest when we get to camp." The remainder of the hike passed in relative silence, both of us conserving energy for the final push. When our clearing finally came into view, I felt an irrational surge of relief, as though we had escaped some unnamed danger by returning to the relative safety of our campsite. The rest of the afternoon was pleasantly uneventful. While Isabella organized our supplies and planned dinner, I stretched out on a blanket with a book I had brought along, though I found myself reading the same paragraph repeatedly as my mind wandered. The exertion of the hike eventually caught up with me and I dozed off, the book open on my chest. I awoke to the sound of wood being stacked. Opening my eyes, I saw that the light had changed. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the clearing. Isabella was building a fire in our stone-ringed pit, carefully arranging kindling beneath larger branches. "Have a good nap?" she asked, noticing I was awake. I sat up, feeling groggy and disoriented. "How long was I out?" "Couple of hours." "You needed it." She struck a match and held it to the dry pine needles serving as tinder. They caught immediately, the flames spreading quickly to the smaller twigs above. As darkness once again descended on the forest, we prepared a more elaborate dinner than the previous night. Pasta with a sauce Isabella had pre-made and frozen for the trip, heated over our camp stove and eaten from the same enamel mugs that had held our morning coffee. The simple meal tasted better than any restaurant fare, enhanced by hunger and the primal satisfaction of eating beside a fire as night fell. After dinner, we sat watching the flames, talking intermittently, but mostly enjoying the companionable silence. The fire cast a circle of light around us, beyond which the darkness of the forest loomed impenetrable. Occasionally a noise would emerge from that darkness, a twig snapping, leaves rustling, the call of a night bird, and each time, I would tense slightly before forcing myself to relax. "You seem jumpy," Isabella observed during one such moment. I hesitated, then decided to be honest. "I guess I am a bit. Last night, I thought I saw something moving outside our tent window. Probably nothing, but it creeped me out." Instead of dismissing my concern, Isabella nodded thoughtfully. "The mind plays tricks in unfamiliar settings, but it's always good to trust your instincts too." She added another log to the fire, sending sparks swirling upward into the night sky. "What did you think you saw?" "I don't know exactly. Just movement, too deliberate to be a branch in the wind. But it was dark, and I was half asleep." "Well, keep an eye out tonight," she said lightly, though something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely unconcerned, "and wake me if you see anything weird." By the time we retired to the tent, the fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the night had grown significantly cooler. We prepared for bed much as we had the previous evening, though this time I was more deliberate in my observation of our surroundings before zipping the tent closed. Again, Isabella fell asleep quickly while I lay awake, staring out the small mesh window near my head. The stars were brilliant above the silhouetted treetops, their cold light providing minimal illumination to the world below. I watched the slow movement of clouds across the night sky, the gentle swaying of branches in the breeze, the occasional bat flitting through my limited field of vision. Just as my eyelids began to grow heavy, something changed in the tableau outside. A shadow moved where no shadow should be, a darkness separate from the trees, shifting with purpose rather than swaying with the wind. I blinked hard, certain I was misinterpreting what I was seeing. When I looked again, the shadow was gone, if it had ever been there at all. But my drowsiness had vanished, replaced by a keen alertness that kept me awake far into the night, watching and waiting for something I couldn't name and didn't truly want to see. The second morning dawned overcast, a layer of gray clouds obscuring the sun and casting a somber pall over the forest. I had finally fallen asleep in the early hours and woke feeling gritty-eyed and unrested. Isabella was still asleep beside me, her breathing deep and regular, her face peaceful in repose. I envied her uncomplicated relationship with this place, her ability to feel at home in the wilderness while I remained perpetually on edge. Careful not to wake her, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The air was heavy with moisture, suggesting rain might be coming. Our campfire from the previous night was nothing but cold ashes now, the stones surrounding it damp with morning dew. I moved to the edge of the clearing to relieve myself, then returned to begin preparing coffee, hoping the familiar ritual would help clear my mind. As I waited for the water to boil on our small stove, I surveyed our campsite with fresh eyes. In the flat gray light of morning, everything looked slightly off, as though the colors had been muted and the shapes made less distinct. Our tent, Isabella's pride, seemed suddenly flimsy, a fragile bubble of civilization in the vast indifference of the forest. The water began to bubble, and I focused on the task at hand, measuring out coffee grounds into our makeshift filter. A paper towel stretched over one of the mugs. As I poured the hot water through, watching the dark liquid accumulate below, a movement at the periphery of my vision caught my attention. I turned quickly, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing unusual, just the endless vertical lines of tree trunks stretching into the distance, their bases disappearing into underbrush, their tops lost in the low-hanging clouds. After a moment, I returned to my coffee preparation, telling myself it was an animal, a squirrel or bird going about its morning business. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about our clearing. Something had changed overnight. Setting the coffee aside to steep, I walked slowly around the perimeter, studying the ground, the surrounding vegetation, the arrangement of our supplies. Everything seemed to be where we had left it, and yet, there, near the path that led to the lake, a small pile of stones stacked one atop another, 3 smooth river rocks balanced in a precise tower. The arrangement was too deliberate to be natural, too careful to be accidental. Someone had placed them there, and recently, as there was no moss or lichen on the freshly exposed surfaces where the stones had been stacked. "Isabella," I called, my voice sounding strangely muffled in the heavy air. "Isabella, could you come out here for a second?" She emerged from the tent moments later, hair tousled from sleep, eyes still heavy-lidded. "What is it?" she asked, then noticed my expression. "What's wrong?" I pointed to the stone stack. "Did you do that?" She frowned, moving closer to examine the arrangement. "No, it wasn't here yesterday." I didn't think so. I glanced around the clearing again, suddenly aware of how exposed we were. Someone was here while we slept. Isabella's frown deepened, but she didn't seem as alarmed as I felt. "It's probably just another hiker marking the trail. People stack stones like this all the time in parks. Right at the edge of our campsite, and we haven't seen another person since we arrived." I shook my head, unconvinced by her explanation. "Plus, the trail is already marked with those blue blazes." She placed a hand on my arm, her touch grounding me slightly. "Let's not jump to conclusions. It could have been here yesterday and we just didn't notice it." I wanted to believe her, but a growing certainty told me otherwise. The stone stack was new, and it had been placed deliberately where we would see it. A message of sorts, though its meaning remained unclear. "Come have some coffee," Isabella said, gently leading me back to the stove. "Everything looks worse on an empty stomach." I allowed myself to be guided, accepting the mug she handed me and sipping the strong, bitter liquid. The familiar taste helped restore a sense of normalcy, and gradually, the initial shock of the discovery faded to a dull unease that sat like a stone in my gut. We ate breakfast, the last of our instant oatmeal, in relative silence, each absorbed in private thoughts. The sky continued to darken overhead, and a fitful breeze had begun to stir the treetops, sending the occasional leaf spiraling down into our clearing. "It might rain," Isabella observed, glancing upward. "Should we pack up early?" We were planning to leave tomorrow morning anyway. The suggestion brought immediate relief, though I tried not to show it. "Might be smart. No point getting all our gear soaked." She nodded, studying my face. "You really want to go, don't you?" I hesitated, torn between honesty and not wanting to seem irrational. I don't like the idea that someone was here while we were sleeping. And there's something about this place that feels off." To my surprise, Isabella didn't argue. She simply nodded again, more slowly this time. "I've been feeling it too, if I'm honest. Not as strongly as you, maybe, but something's not quite right here." She reached for my hand. "Let's pack up and go. We can stop somewhere nice for lunch on the way home." The decision made, we set about dismantling our campsite with practiced efficiency. Isabella took charge of the tent while I gathered our cooking supplies and remaining food. We worked methodically, checking each area of the clearing to ensure we were leaving nothing behind. As I was rolling up our sleeping bags, I noticed something tucked into the mesh pocket on the interior wall of the tent. A small folded piece of paper that hadn't been there before. My heart began to race as I reached for it with suddenly unsteady hands. "Isabella," I called, my voice tight. "Did you put something in the tent pocket?" She looked up from where she was collapsing the tent poles. "No, what is it?" I unfolded the paper carefully. On it, drawn in what appeared to be charcoal, was a crude depiction of two figures sleeping inside a tent. Above the tent, watching from what looked like a tree branch, was a third figure. No features were visible on any of the figures, they were just simple stick drawings, but the implication was unmistakable. Someone had been watching us. Someone had entered our tent while we slept. "We need to go," I said, showing Isabella the drawing. "Now." Her face paled as she studied the crude image. Without a word, she returned to dismantling the tent with renewed urgency. I stuffed the drawing into my pocket and continued packing, every sense heightened to painful acuity. The forest around us suddenly seemed alive with hidden presences, every shadow a potential hiding place, every sound a possible footfall. The rain began as we were loading the last of our equipment into the car, just a light drizzle at first, but quickly intensifying to a steady downpour that drummed on the roof and blurred the view through the windshield. I climbed into the driver's seat, hands shaking slightly as I inserted the key into the ignition. Isabella slid into the passenger seat beside me, soaked from the rain, her earlier composure now visibly shaken. "Who would do something like this?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the rain. "And why?" I had no answer for her. I turned the key, relieved when the engine rumbled to life immediately. As I shifted into reverse and began the careful process of turning the car around on the narrow gravel road, I glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. Standing at the edge of the trees, Partially obscured by the curtain of rain but unmistakably present, was a figure. Too distant to make out clearly, it appeared to be simply watching us. A dark silhouette against the darker forest, unmoving despite the downpour. "What is it?" Isabella asked, noticing my expression. She turned to look through the rain-streaked rear window. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Is that a person?" "Don't look," I said, pressing the accelerator a bit too hard and causing the tires to spin briefly in the mud before finding purchase. "Just don't look." The car lurched forward, tires crunching on gravel as we began our escape from the campsite. I resisted the urge to look back again, focusing instead on the narrow road ahead, barely visible through the rain and encroaching vegetation. Beside me, Isabella kept glancing over her shoulder, her breathing quick and shallow. "I can't see anyone now," she said after a few minutes. "Maybe it wasn't just anything," I interrupted, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Someone was there. Someone left that drawing. Someone built that stone pile." She didn't argue, just reached across to place her hand on my arm. Whether to comfort me or herself, I couldn't tell. We drove in tense silence. The only sounds the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers and the steady drumming of rain on the roof. The gravel road seemed longer on the return journey, each bend revealing only more dense forest, rather than the promised intersection with the paved highway. Had we taken a wrong turn? The rain and poor visibility made it difficult to be certain, but a growing sense of dread suggested we were no longer on the path we had traveled to reach the campsite. "This doesn't look right," Isabella said, giving voice to my concerns. She pulled out her phone. No signal, of course. I slowed the car, peering through the rain-washed windshield at what appeared to be a fork in the road ahead, a division I had no memory of from our arrival. "Which way?" I asked, not really expecting an answer. Isabella leaned forward, squinting at the unmarked paths. I'm not sure. Maybe right. The left one looks more overgrown." I nodded, taking the right fork and proceeding cautiously. The road narrowed further, branches scraping against the sides of the car as we pushed deeper into the unknown territory. The rain continued unabated, transforming the dirt track into a muddy channel that threatened to trap our tires with each passing yard. "Maybe we should turn back," Isabella suggested after several tense minutes. "Try the other fork." Before I could respond, something darted across the road ahead, a flash of movement too quick to identify but unmistakably human in its proportions. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly in the mud before coming to a stop. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Isabella nodded, her face drained of color. "Someone ran across the road." We sat in frozen silence, the engine idling, rain hammering on the roof. Nothing further moved on the road ahead or in the dense forest to either side. After what felt like an eternity but was probably less than a minute, I slowly released the brake and allowed the car to creep forward again. "What is happening?" Isabella murmured, more to herself than to me. This can't be real." But it was real. The rain, the mud, the isolated road, and the growing certainty that we were not alone in these woods. Someone was out there watching us, tracking our movements, playing some incomprehensible game with rules only they understood. As we rounded another bend in the seemingly endless forest road, relief flooded through me at the sight of pavement ahead, the state highway that would take us back to civilization. I accelerated slightly, eager to leave the dirt track and its mysteries behind. Just as we approached the junction, a final glance in the rearview mirror revealed something that turned my momentary relief to ice in my veins. Standing in the middle of the road we had just traveled, clearly visible despite the rain, was a figure wearing what appeared to be a mask. Not a ski mask or Halloween costume, but one of those realistic rubber masks depicting a former president, its features frozen in a grotesque parody of a human face. The figure raised one hand slowly and waved, the gesture almost friendly if not for the context and the expressionless mask. Then as I watched in horror, it turned and walked deliberately into the forest, disappearing among the trees. "Drive," Isabella said, her voice tight with fear. She had seen it too. "Just drive." I didn't need to be told twice. I pressed the accelerator to the floor as soon as we hit the paved highway, the car fishtailing slightly before finding traction on the wet asphalt. We sped away from the forest, from the campsite, from the masked figure who had turned our peaceful retreat into a waking nightmare. Neither of us spoke for several miles, the only sound the rhythmic thump of the wipers and the hiss of tires on wet pavement. The rain gradually diminished as we distanced ourselves from the forest, as though the weather itself had been part of the strange, threatening atmosphere we had escaped. Who was that? Isabella finally asked, breaking the silence. What did they want? I shook my head, unable to formulate an answer that made any sense. I don't know. But they were watching us. They were there the whole time. She shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself despite the car's heater working at full blast. I keep thinking about that drawing. They were in our tent, James, while we were asleep. The thought made my skin crawl. I remembered my restless night, the shadows I thought I'd seen moving outside the tent window. Had our nocturnal visitor been there, watching me watch for them in some twisted game of mutual observation? We should report this, Isabella said after another long silence. To the police or the park rangers or someone. I nodded, though a part of me doubted the authorities would take us seriously. What could we tell them? That someone had stacked some stones and left a crude drawing? That we had seen a person wearing a mask? None of it was technically criminal, just deeply, profoundly unsettling. As the miles accumulated between us and the forest, a strange sort of numbness settled over me. The immediate fear receded, replaced by a hollow feeling in the pit of my stomach. We had escaped whatever bizarre scenario had been unfolding around us, but the experience had left a mark that I suspected would not fade quickly. Let's stop somewhere, Isabella suggested as we approached a small town. Get some real food, use a bathroom, try to feel normal again. I agreed, pulling into the parking lot of a roadside diner that promised home cooking in neon letters above the entrance. As we sat across from each other in a vinyl booth, steam rising from mugs of coffee that neither of us really wanted, but ordered out of habit, the strangeness of our situation fully dawned on me. Do you think we imagined it? I asked quietly. Not all of it, obviously, but the worst parts. The masked person. Isabella considered the question, stirring her coffee absently. No, she said finally. We both saw it. And the drawing was real. Do you still have it? I reached into my pocket, half expecting the paper to have vanished as some kind of mass hallucination, but my fingers closed around it immediately. I withdrew it and unfolded it carefully on the table between us. The crude charcoal drawing hadn't changed. 2 stick figures in a tent, a third figure watching from above. Simple, childlike almost, yet profoundly disturbing in its implications and mysteriously placed in our tent while we slept. Real, Isabella said firmly, pushing the drawing away as though it might contaminate her. All of it was real. I refolded the paper and returned it to my pocket, unsure why I was keeping it but reluctant to dispose of the only tangible evidence of our experience. We finished our coffee in silence, paid the bill, and returned to the car, both of us moving with the mechanical precision of people operating on autopilot. The remainder of the drive passed in alternating periods of tense silence and forced casual conversation, as though by discussing mundane topics, work deadlines, an upcoming birthday party for a mutual friend, plans for the weekend, we could somehow normalize what had happened. By the time we reached the outskirts of the city, the forest and its mysteries had begun to take on the quality of a shared nightmare, still vivid but increasingly unreal. As we unloaded our camping equipment into our apartment, the familiar surroundings should have provided comfort, but instead they seemed fragile, their security and illusion easily penetrated. I found myself checking the locks twice, drawing the curtains tight against the gathering darkness outside. That night, Isabella and I lay in our bed. The sounds of the city, traffic, distant sirens, the occasional shout or laugh from the street below, filtering through the walls. Sounds that had once irritated me now served as a reminder that we were surrounded by people, by civilization, by the ordered world I understood. Do you think we'll ever know what it was about? Isabella asked softly in the darkness. Why us? Why that place? I had no answer, only questions of my own that circled endlessly without resolution. Who had been watching us? What did they want? Was it some kind of threat? Some perverted game or something else entirely? The not knowing was perhaps the worst part. The sense that we had glimpsed only the surface of something deeper and more disturbing that we might never fully comprehend. I don't know, I replied finally. Maybe it's better if we don't. Isabella's hand found mine beneath the covers, her fingers intertwining with my own. I keep thinking about what my dad used to say about camping showing who people really are. I thought about the masked figure standing in the rain, waving almost casually as we fled. What did that reveal about who they really were? And what did our reaction, our fear, our flight reveal about us? "Let's try to sleep," I said, squeezing her hand gently. "Things will seem clearer in the morning." But as I closed my eyes, the image of the crude drawing floated in my mind. The watching figure, the vulnerable sleepers, the violation of that most basic human need for safety. And behind my eyelids, like an after-image burned onto my retinas, I could still see the expressionless mask, the slow, deliberate wave, the figure disappearing into the trees as though the forest itself had opened to receive it. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no rest. Only dreams of watching and being watched. A forest where the trees had eyes, of masks that couldn't be removed because there was nothing behind them. The days following our return from the camping trip passed in a blur of routine activities that did little to dispel the lingering unease we both felt. We went to work, met with friends, watched television, cooked meals, all the normal components of our urban existence, but beneath these ordinary actions ran an undercurrent of disquiet that manifested in small, behavioral changes we both noticed but rarely discussed. Isabella began checking that the apartment doors and windows were locked multiple times each night, a ritual she performed with increasing meticulousness. I found myself avoiding windows after dark, uncomfortable with the idea that someone might be looking in from outside. We both startled more easily at unexpected noises, and neither of us slept well, though we didn't always acknowledge the nightmares that woke us. A week after our return, as we were preparing dinner in our small kitchen, Isabella finally broached the subject we had been dancing around. "I can't stop thinking about it," she said, dicing an onion with more force than necessary. "The camping trip. The masked person." I nodded, not surprised by the admission. "Me neither. I keep wondering, what if they followed us? What if they know where we live?" She set down her knife, turning to face me directly. "Am I being paranoid?" The question hung in the air between us, weighted with all the fears and uncertainties we'd been suppressing. I wanted to reassure her, to dismiss her concerns as irrational, but the truth was that similar thoughts had been haunting me as well. "I don't think so," I said carefully. "It's natural to feel this way after what happened. But realistically, how would they have followed us? We drove for hours and no one was behind us on the road." Isabella nodded, seemingly comforted by the logic, and returned to her cooking. But later that night, as we were preparing for bed, she paused by the bedroom window, staring out at the darkened city street below. "There's a car I don't recognize," she said, her voice tight. "It's been parked across the street for the past 2 nights." I joined her at the window, following her gaze to a dark sedan positioned under a streetlight about 50 yards from our building entrance. Nothing about it appeared particularly suspicious. It was just one of dozens of vehicles lining both sides of the street. But the fact that Isabella had noticed its presence on multiple nights gave me pause. "Probably belongs to one of the neighbors," I suggested, though without much conviction. "Or a visitor staying overnight." Isabella didn't respond immediately, her eyes still fixed on the vehicle below. "Maybe," she said finally, letting the curtain fall back into place. "But I'm going to keep an eye on it." Sleep was elusive that night, our conversation having stirred up all the anxiety and fear that we had been trying to suppress. I lay awake long after Isabella's breathing had deepened into sleep, my mind replaying the events at the campsite in an endless loop. The stone stack, the drawing, the masked figure waving from the rain-soaked road. What had it all meant? Was it simply a twisted prank by some local person who enjoyed terrorizing campers? Or was there some deeper, more sinister purpose that we had escaped by leaving early? The questions circled without resolution, keeping me awake until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the bedroom curtains. The next day was Saturday, and we had made plans weeks earlier to meet friends for brunch, an obligation that now felt burdensome given our state of mind, but which neither of us suggested canceling. Perhaps, I thought, some normalcy was exactly what we needed. As we were leaving the apartment, Isabella paused in the lobby, her attention caught by something on the community bulletin board near the main entrance. I followed her gaze to a crudely drawn poster that had been tacked among the advertisements for yoga classes and used furniture sales. "Missing," the poster proclaimed in large block letters. Beneath the text was a grainy photograph of a young man smiling awkwardly at the camera. According to the accompanying text, Jonathan Wheeler, age 29, had not been seen or heard from in 3 weeks. He had last mentioned to friends that he was planning a weekend camping trip north of the city. Isabella's hand found mine, her fingers cold despite the warm spring morning. "North of the city," she repeated softly. "Like where we went." I studied the photograph more closely, looking for some recognition, some connection to our experience, but the face was unfamiliar. "It's probably just a coincidence," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Lots of people go camping north of the city." But as we walked to the restaurant to meet our friends, the coincidence, if that's what it was, nagged at me. The timing aligned uncomfortably well with our own experience. If Jonathan Wheeler had gone camping in the same general area just before us, had he encountered the masked watcher too? And if so, what had happened to him? Brunch was a strained affair, both of us making efforts at normalcy that must have seemed transparent to our friends, though they were too polite to comment directly. We deflected questions about our camping trip with vague positive responses, neither of us willing to discuss the reality of what had happened. As we walked home afterward, Isabella broached the subject that had clearly been occupying her thoughts throughout the meal. "We should report it," she said decisively. "What happened to us, I mean. Especially with that missing person poster. It could be related." I hesitated, weighing the options. On one hand, if there was any connection between our experience and Jonathan Wheeler's disappearance, we had a moral obligation to share what we knew. On the other hand, what exactly did we know? That we had been watched? That someone had left a drawing in our tent? That we had seen a person in a mask who had done nothing more threatening than wave? What would we even say? I asked finally. We don't have any actual evidence of a crime, and we didn't see anything directly related to this Jonathan person. Isabella frowned, clearly frustrated by my reluctance. We could at least tell them about the location, about the masked person. It might help them narrow their search area. She had a point, and my resistance was perhaps more about my own discomfort with the idea of revisiting the experience of having to articulate it to skeptical police officers who would likely view us as hysterical urbanites, spooked by normal wilderness encounters, then about any logical objection. "Okay," I conceded. "We'll go to the police station tomorrow." The decision made, we continued our walk home in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. As we approached our apartment building, Isabella suddenly gripped my arm, her fingers digging painfully into my bicep. "The car," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's still there." I followed her gaze to the dark sedan still parked in the exact same spot as the previous night. In daylight, there was nothing particularly remarkable about it. A mid-range model a few years old with tinted windows that prevented any view of the interior. But its continued presence after our conversation the night before sent a chill down my spine. "Wait here," I said, a sudden determination overriding my usual caution. Before Isabella could object, I crossed the street, approaching the vehicle with what I hoped appeared to be casual interest rather than the mounting anxiety I actually felt. The car was empty, or at least appeared to be from what I could see through the windows, which were tinted but not completely opaque. Nothing about it seemed out of the ordinary. No unusual items visible on the seats or dashboard, no indications of recent occupation. I circled it once, noting the out-of-state license plate and a thin layer of dust that suggested it hadn't been moved in at least a couple of days. As I completed my circuit, movement in my peripheral vision caused me to turn sharply toward the small park that occupied the corner of our block. A figure was standing beside a cluster of trees at the park's edge, partially obscured by the foliage but unmistakably watching me. My heart rate accelerated as I strained to make out details. Height, build, clothing. But the person was too distant and too well concealed by the trees for any specifics to be clear. What was clear, however, was that they were observing my inspection of the car with apparent interest. As this realization dawned, the figure stepped back, disappearing entirely behind the trees before I could even think to approach or call out. I returned to Isabella, who had been watching anxiously from the sidewalk in front of our building. "The car's empty," I reported, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I think someone was watching me from the park. They left when they saw me notice them." Her face paled. "Did you see who it was?" "Was it—" She didn't complete the question, but I knew what she was asking. "Was it the masked figure from the forest?" "I couldn't tell," I admitted. "They were too far away and partially hidden by trees. But they definitely seemed interested in the fact that I was looking at the car." We hurried into our building, checking over our shoulders repeatedly as though expecting pursuit. Once inside our apartment, doors double-locked behind us, Isabella began pacing the living room, her earlier composure completely shattered. "It's them," she said, her voice tight with fear. "They followed us somehow. They know where we live." I wanted to offer reassurance, to suggest alternative explanations. Perhaps the car and the observer were completely unrelated to our camping experience. Perhaps it was all an unfortunate coincidence, but the words died in my throat. The growing sense that we were being targeted, that our brief and terrifying encounter in the forest had somehow followed us home, was too strong to dismiss with rational explanations. "We'll go to the police," I said instead, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "First thing tomorrow, we'll tell them everything. The camping incident, the missing person poster, the car, the person watching from the park. They'll have to take it seriously." Isabella nodded, though she didn't appear particularly comforted by the plan. "And tonight? What do we do tonight?" It was a good question, and one I didn't have a satisfactory answer for. The idea of remaining in the apartment, wondering if we were being watched, waiting for some unknown threat to materialize, was almost unbearable. But what alternative did we have? "We could stay with friends," I suggested. "Make up some excuse about plumbing problems or something." She considered this briefly, then shook her head. "No, I don't want to involve anyone else in this. What if we're followed to their place? What if we put them at risk too?" Her concern was valid, and I felt a surge of guilt for not having considered the potential danger to others. "A hotel then," I amended. "Somewhere downtown with security and lots of people around." This suggestion met with more approval. Isabella immediately began gathering overnight essentials, while I searched online for available hotel rooms, eventually securing one at a mid-range chain hotel about 20 minutes away by taxi. As we prepared to leave, I found myself checking the street repeatedly from various windows, looking for any sign of the observer from the park or activity around the mysterious car. The street appeared normal, residents coming and going, delivery trucks making their rounds, dogs being walked, but the ordinary scenes did little to alleviate my growing sense of paranoia. The taxi arrived promptly when called, and we made our way down to the street entrance, both of us scanning our surroundings with hypervigilance. The dark sedan remained in its spot, silent and inscrutable. The park appeared empty, at least from our vantage point. Nothing seemed overtly threatening, and yet the feeling of being observed, of being hunted in some obscure way, persisted. The hotel provided temporary relief. The anonymity of the generic room, the presence of other guests in the hallways and lobby, the multiple locks on the door. We ordered room service rather than venturing out again, eating mechanically without really tasting the food. Both of us too preoccupied with our situation to enjoy the meal or even make much conversation. That night, sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the normal sounds of a hotel, distant elevators, ice machines, guests returning late to their rooms, each one causing me to start awake, momentarily disoriented and afraid. Beside me, Isabella seemed equally restless, tossing and turning, occasionally muttering in her sleep. Morning brought no clarity or resolution, only the practical reality that we couldn't hide in a hotel indefinitely. We checked out, took a taxi to the nearest police station, and spent the next 2 hours attempting to convey our experience to a series of increasingly skeptical officers. The report we filed felt inadequate even as we were completing it. Without concrete evidence of a crime, without any direct connection to Jonathan Wheeler beyond the coincidence of similar camping locations, our account of being watched by a masked figure and subsequently followed back to the city was treated with polite but obvious disbelief. "We'll look into it," the officer, taking our statement, assured us, in a tone that suggested nothing of the sort would happen. "In the meantime, be aware of your surroundings and report any direct threats immediately." As we left the station, the futility of our effort weighed heavily upon us. What had we expected? That the police would mount a full-scale investigation, based on our story of a creepy encounter in the woods and a possibly suspicious car? That they would connect the dots between our experience and the disappearance of a man we had never met, based solely on the general location of his last known plans? That was useless, Isabella said as we walked back toward our apartment, her voice flat with disappointment. They think we're crazy. I couldn't disagree. The skepticism had been evident in every aspect of our interaction with the police. The exchanged glances, the perfunctory note-taking, the barely concealed impatience as we described the drawing found in our tent, and the masked figure waving from the rain-soaked road. At least we tried, I offered weakly. And there's a record now if anything else happens. The if hung in the air between us, neither of us willing to articulate the alternative possibility, that nothing more would happen, that the entire episode would remain an unexplained and disturbing anomaly in our otherwise ordinary lives. Somehow that prospect seemed almost as unsettling as the idea of continued harassment. As we rounded the corner onto our street, Isabella suddenly stopped walking, her hand shooting out to grasp my arm. "The car," she said. "It's gone." I followed her gaze to the spot where the dark sedan had been parked for the past several days. It was indeed empty, the space now occupied by a different vehicle entirely. A momentary relief washed over me, followed quickly by a new anxiety. If the car was gone, where had its owner gone? And why now? Just after we had reported our concerns to the police. Maybe it really was just a neighbor's car, I suggested, not believing it myself. Or a visitor who left this morning. Isabella shook her head, unconvinced. The timing is too coincidental. They knew we were going to the police. They're covering their tracks. The surveillance hypothesis, which had seemed paranoid just days earlier, now felt disturbingly plausible. If we were being watched, if our movements were being monitored, then our trip to the police station would have been noted, and if the watcher had any reason to avoid police scrutiny. "Let's get inside," I said, suddenly aware of how exposed we were on the public sidewalk. We can figure out what to do next from there. Once in our apartment, doors locked and curtains drawn, we faced the uncomfortable reality of our situation. We had no proof of any wrongdoing, no clear threat to report, nothing concrete to act upon. Just a series of unsettling events that might or might not be connected, that might or might not represent actual danger. We could leave town for a while, Isabella suggested as we sat at our kitchen table, untouched mugs of tea growing cold before us. Visit my parents, maybe. They've been asking us to come anyway. The idea had merit. Her parents lived several hours away, in a small town where the appearance of strangers would be immediately noticed. If we were being followed, it would be much more difficult for someone to maintain surveillance without attracting attention there. That might be good, I agreed. Give us some distance, some time to think. Decision made, Isabella called her parents to arrange the visit, while I began researching transportation options. We agreed on a rental car rather than taking the train, harder to track, more flexibility in our movements. We would leave the following morning as soon as the rental office opened. That night, as we packed and made preparations for our departure, a strange calm descended upon me. Perhaps it was the relief of having a plan, or perhaps simply the exhaustion of sustained fear. But for the first time since our camping trip, I felt something approaching normal. We went to bed early, both of us more relaxed than we had been in days. Outside, the usual sounds of the city provided a comforting backdrop to our preparations for sleep. I had just begun to drift off when a sharp metallic sound jerked me back to full alertness. "What was that?" Isabella whispered beside me, confirming that she had heard it too. I sat up, straining to identify the noise. It had sounded like metal scraping against metal, perhaps from the fire escape outside our bedroom window. As I listened, it came again, clearer this time. The unmistakable sound of someone climbing the metal stairs of the fire escape. "Call 911, I said quietly, slipping out of bed and moving to the window. Through a small gap in the curtains, I could just make out a dark shape on the landing, one floor below ours, moving with deliberate care up the final flight of stairs that would bring them level with our apartment. Isabella was already on the phone, her voice a tense whisper as she gave our address and reported an intruder on the fire escape. I continued watching through the narrow opening in the curtains, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain it must be audible. The figure reached our landing and paused, seemingly surveying our window. They were dressed entirely in dark clothing, their features impossible to discern in the shadows. For a moment they remained motionless, and I had the distinct impression they were aware of being observed, that somehow, despite the minimal gap in the curtains and the darkness of our bedroom, they knew I was watching them just as they were watching us. Then, with deliberate slowness, they raised one hand to their face. Even in the dim light filtering from the street below, I could see what they were holding. A mask, the same rubber president mask from the forest. As I watched, frozen in horror, they began to lift it toward their face. A sudden siren wail from the street below shattered the moment. The figure jerked, clearly startled by the sound, then turned and descended the fire escape with astonishing speed, disappearing into the alley below just as red and blue lights began to reflect off the surrounding buildings. "They're coming," Isabella said, ending her call. "The police are almost here." I nodded, unable to speak, my eyes still fixed on the now empty fire escape. The mask, the same mask from the forest, left no room for doubt or coincidence. We were being targeted, deliberately and personally, by the same individual who had watched us from the trees, who had entered our tent while we slept, who had waved to us from the rain-soaked road. When the police arrived minutes later, they took our statement with more seriousness than they had shown earlier at the station. The attempted break-in via fire escape was a concrete crime, not just a vague feeling of being watched. They searched the alley and surrounding streets but found no sign of the intruder. "You should stay somewhere else tonight," the senior officer advised as they prepared to leave. "We'll have patrols check your building regularly, but with this fire escape access, it's not secure." We didn't need to be told twice. Within an hour, we had packed essential items and were checking into a different hotel. This one selected for its enhanced security features. Internal corridors only. Keycard access required for the elevator. 24-hour front desk staff. In our new temporary sanctuary, Isabella sat on the edge of the bed, her face pale in the harsh hotel lighting. "It's the same person," she said, not a question but a statement of fact. "From the forest. With the mask." I nodded, the implications washing over me in waves of escalating fear. This wasn't a random incident of urban crime. Wasn't a coincidence or paranoia. Someone had followed us from the campsite, had tracked us to our home, had watched and waited for the right moment to approach. But why? Isabella continued, voicing the question that had been haunting me since that rain-soaked day in the forest. "What do they want from us?" I had no answer, only theories too disturbing to articulate. We had stumbled into something, witnessed something perhaps, that we weren't supposed to see. The missing camper, Jonathan Wheeler, now seemed less like a coincidence and more like a warning of what might happen to those who ventured into the wrong part of the forest, who caught the attention of the wrong watcher. "We leave first thing tomorrow," I said, sitting beside her and taking her hands in mine. "We stick to the plan. Go to your parents, regroup, figure out what to do next, and we report everything to the police again. The mask, the connection to what happened in the forest. They'll have to take it seriously now." Isabella nodded, leaning against me, her body trembling slightly. "Do you think they'll find us there too? At my parents'?" It was the question I had been avoiding, the fear underlying all our plans. If our watcher had found our apartment, had tracked us so effectively through the city, what was to prevent them from following us to our next destination? "I don't know," I admitted, seeing no value in false reassurance. "But we'll be more aware now, more careful. And there's safety in numbers." We didn't sleep that night, taking turns to watch the door and windowless hotel room, jumping at every sound from the corridor outside. Morning couldn't come fast enough, bringing with it the promise of escape, of distance, of relative safety among family and familiar surroundings. As we checked out of the hotel and made our way to the rental car agency, I found myself scanning every face, scrutinizing every parked vehicle, analyzing every movement in our vicinity with hyper-awareness. The masked watcher had transformed our world into a landscape of potential threats, had stolen our sense of security and replaced it with constant, annoying fear. The rental process went smoothly and soon we were driving away from the city, both of us watching the rearview mirror for any sign of pursuit. The highway stretched before us, carrying us away from the immediate danger, but not from the questions that continued to haunt us. nor from the certainty that our encounter in the forest had irrevocably changed us. What had begun as a simple camping trip, an escape from urban confinement, had become something far darker, an initiation into a world where safety was illusory, where being watched was a constant state, where masks concealed identities but revealed intentions. And as the city receded behind us, I couldn't escape the feeling that we weren't driving toward safety, but merely extending a game whose rules and objectives remained terrifyingly unclear. The journey to Isabella's parents' home passed in tense silence, both of us watching for signs of pursuit that never materialized. We took deliberate detours, changed highways unexpectedly, even doubled back at one point. All precautions that probably weren't necessary but provided some illusion of control over our situation. Isabella's hometown was exactly as she had described it. A small community where unfamiliar faces were noticed and remarked upon, where neighbors still knew each other by name, where doors were often left unlocked, despite occasional reminders from the local sheriff about basic security. It was, in theory, the perfect refuge from our urban nightmare. Her parents welcomed us with the enthusiasm of people who didn't see their daughter often enough, fussing over our tired appearances but attributing it to the stress of city living, rather than the terror we had been experiencing. We had agreed in advance not to tell them the full story, at least not immediately. There seemed no point in worrying them when we ourselves weren't sure what we were dealing with. "You two look exhausted," Isabella's mother said as she served dinner that first evening. "The city must be taking its toll." Isabella managed a weak smile. "Just needed a break, Mom. Thanks for letting us come on short notice." "You know you're always welcome," her father replied, passing a bowl of mashed potatoes. "Stay as long as you like. The guest room is yours." That night, in the familiar surroundings of Isabella's childhood home, sleep finally came for both of us, the deep, restorative kind that had eluded us since the camping trip. Perhaps it was the presence of others nearby, or the distance from the city, or simply the exhaustion catching up with us, but for the first time in what felt like ages, I didn't dream of masks or watchers or dark forests. The respite was temporary. By the third day of our visit, the initial relief began to fade, replaced by a creeping anxiety that manifested in small but significant ways. I found myself checking and rechecking the locks on doors and windows, positioning myself in restaurants and public places with my back to the wall, scanning every unfamiliar face for signs of recognition or threat. Isabella noticed, of course. "You're doing it again," she said quietly as we sat in a local cafe, my eyes constantly darting to the entrance with each new arrival. "We're safe here. No one followed us." I nodded, trying to relax my vigilance but finding it nearly impossible. "Probably," I agreed. "But we thought we were safe in our apartment too." She couldn't argue with that. Instead, she reached across the table to take my hand, her touch a reminder that whatever we were facing it together. The illusion of safety shattered completely on our fourth night in town. We had joined Isabella's parents for dinner at a neighbor's house, returning to find something tucked into the screen door of the front porch, a folded piece of paper, unremarkable except for its unexplained presence. Isabella's father picked it up, unfolding it casually. "Looks like someone left you a note," he said, handing it to his daughter. Her sharp intake of breath told me everything before I even saw the paper's contents. When she wordlessly passed it to me, my worst fears were confirmed. Drawn in the same crude charcoal style as the image we had found in our tent, the picture showed a small house, recognizably Isabella's parents' home, with 4 stick figures inside. Outside the house, watching through a window, was a 5th figure. "What is it?" Isabella's mother asked, noting our obvious distress. "Just a strange joke," I improvised, folding the paper and shoving it into my pocket. "Someone must have mistaken this house for someone else's." Isabella's parents exchanged confused glances but didn't press the issue, attributing our discomfort to city people's wariness of unexpected communications. Once inside, doors locked behind us, a precaution that Isabella's father complied with despite his clear bemusement. Isabella and I retreated to the guest room for a whispered conference. "They found us," she said, her voice breaking. "How did they find us?" I had no answer, only the cold certainty that our watcher had indeed tracked us to this supposedly safe haven. had perhaps been observing us for days without our knowledge. The thought made my skin crawl, made me want to check every closet and corner of the house for hidden observers. "We need to tell your parents," I said, reaching a difficult decision. "They need to know what's happening, that there might be danger." Isabella nodded reluctantly. "You're right, but they'll never understand. They'll think we're overreacting, or worse, that we've lost our minds. We'll show them the drawings, the original from the tent and this new one. That's physical evidence. And we'll tell them about the attempted break-in at our apartment, about the police report we filed. Make it clear this isn't imagination or paranoia." The conversation with her parents went about as well as could be expected. Initial disbelief giving way to concern, not necessarily about the threat itself, but about our mental state. They listened patiently as we recounted the camping incident, the surveillance we believed we had been under, the masked figure on the fire escape. Their expressions shifted from confusion to worry to a kind of cautious acceptance that something had certainly affected us deeply, whether or not the danger was as real or imminent as we believed. "You should talk to Sheriff Wilson in the morning," Isabella's father suggested when we had finished our account. "He's known me for 30 years. If there's someone hanging around town who shouldn't be, he'll take it seriously." It was a reasonable suggestion, and we agreed to visit the local sheriff's office the next day. That night, none of us slept well. Isabella's parents took our concerns seriously enough to double-check the locks and leave a few strategic lights on throughout the house, though I could tell they still attributed much of our fear to urban paranoia rather than legitimate threat. Morning brought a clear sky and warm sunshine that seemed to mock the darkness of our situation. After breakfast, Isabella and I walked the few blocks to the small sheriff's office, the drawings carefully preserved in an envelope as our primary evidence. Sheriff Wilson was a stereotypical small-town lawman, middle-aged, slightly overweight, with a no-nonsense demeanor softened by genuine concern for the community he served. He listened to our story without interruption, examining the drawings with a thoughtful expression that neither validated nor dismissed our fears. "I'll be straight with you," he said, when we had finished. "This is strange, no doubt about it. But there's not much I can do officially. No laws have been broken here in town. Leaving a drawing on a porch isn't a crime, even if it's creepy as hell." "But the break-in attempt in the city," Isabella began, "is a matter for city police," he finished for her. "I'll call them, compare notes, see if there's anything connecting your case to anything we know about. But in the meantime, all I can offer is extra patrols past your parents' house and my personal assurance that nothing happens in this town without me hearing about it eventually." It wasn't the response we had hoped for, but it was better than outright dismissal. Sheriff Wilson took copies of the drawings for his files, recorded our detailed description of the masked figure, and promised to alert his deputies to watch for any strangers matching that description. As we left the sheriff's office, I felt the familiar weight of helplessness settling back upon my shoulders. The authorities, both in the city and here in this small town, were limited in what they could do without more concrete evidence, without a clearer threat or crime to investigate. "What now?" Isabella asked as we walked slowly back toward her parents' house. "Do we just wait for them to make another move? To leave another drawing or try to break in?" I shook my head, an idea forming that I had been reluctant to consider until now. "No, we go back." "Back?" Her voice rose in alarm. "Back to the city?" "Back to the campsite," I clarified, the decision crystallizing as I spoke. "Whatever this is, it started there. Something about that place, something we saw or did or interrupted. That's the key to understanding what's happening to us." Isabella stopped walking, staring at me in disbelief. "You want to go back to the place where this nightmare began, deliberately put ourselves in danger?" "We're already in danger," I pointed out. "They found us here, in your hometown. They'll find us wherever we go. At least if we return to the source, we might get answers instead of just running endlessly." She was quiet for a long moment, processing the suggestion. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the fear I knew she must be feeling. "You're right. Whatever this is, it won't stop until we confront it." The decision made, we returned to Isabella's parents' home to make preparations. They were predictably horrified by our plan. "This is madness," her father insisted when we explained our intention to return to the campsite. If you really believe someone is targeting you, the last thing you should do is go to an isolated location where they might have the advantage. Dad, we're not asking permission, Isabella said with a firmness that clearly surprised him. We're telling you what we're going to do. If we don't come back within 3 days, tell Sheriff Wilson everything and have him contact the forest rangers near the campsite. Her parents continued to object, offering alternatives, staying with different relatives, hiring private security, even suggesting therapy to help us process what they clearly still believed might be shared delusion rather than actual threat. But in the end, they recognized the determination in their daughter's eyes and reluctantly accepted our decision, extracting promises about regular check-ins and safety precautions. We left the following morning in our rental car, armed with supplies more suited to vigilance than recreation, powerful flashlights, a hunting knife borrowed from Isabella's father, an emergency satellite beacon that would work even without cell service. The journey back toward the forest was tense but purposeful, our fear now channeled into a desperate need for answers and resolution. As we approached the turnoff for the gravel road that would take us to the campsite, Isabella's hand found mine on the steering wheel. "Are we making a terrible mistake?" she asked softly. I considered the question seriously. Maybe. Probably even. But I don't see any other way forward. We can't live like this, constantly looking over our shoulders, jumping at shadows, wondering when they'll appear next. Whatever happens at the campsite, at least it will be an ending of sorts. She nodded, squeezing my hand before releasing it so I could navigate the increasingly rough terrain. The gravel road was just as I remembered it, winding, isolated, bordered by encroaching forest that seemed to watch our progress with ancient, indifferent eyes. We reached the small clearing where we had parked during our previous visit. But this time, instead of unloading camping equipment and hiking to our selected site, we simply sat in the car, engine idling, surveying our surroundings with heightened awareness. "What exactly are we looking for?" Isabella asked after several minutes of silent observation. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "Signs that someone else is here, I guess. Or anything unusual that might explain why we were targeted." Nothing about. The clearing appeared different from our previous visit. Same rough parking area, same forest paths leading off in various directions, same oppressive silence broken only by occasional bird calls and the whisper of wind through pine needles. "Let's drive a bit further," I suggested, putting the car in gear. "See if there are other access points, other campsites." The gravel road continued past the parking area, narrowing further but still passable in our rental car if driven carefully. We proceeded slowly, both of us scanning the forest on either side for anything out of the ordinary. After about half a mile, the road curved sharply, and as we rounded the bend, I slammed on the brakes so suddenly that Isabella was thrown forward against her seatbelt. She gasped, then fell silent as she registered what had brought us to such an abrupt halt. Parked on the side of the road ahead was a dark sedan, a vehicle unmistakably similar to the one that had been stationed outside our apartment building in the city. Even from this distance, I could make out the same out-of-state license plate. "It's them," Isabella whispered, her voice tight with fear. "They're here." I nodded, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. Decision time. Do we confront this or retreat? The question hung in the air between us, weighted with all the fear and uncertainty of the past weeks. Retreating meant continuing our existence as hunted things, never knowing when or where our watcher would appear next. Confronting meant deliberately placing ourselves in the path of someone who had already demonstrated a disturbing obsession with our lives. "I can't keep living like this," Isabella said finally, her voice stronger now despite the slight tremor in her hands. "Let's end it." I put the car in reverse, backing up around the bend until we were out of sight of the sedan, then turned off the engine. "We'll approach on foot," I explained. "Stay in the trees. Try to get a look at whoever's driving that car without being seen ourselves." Isabella nodded, reaching into the backpack we had brought and withdrawing her father's hunting knife. She passed it to me without comment, her expression grim. "I won't use this unless absolutely necessary," I said, tucking the knife into. My belt where it would be accessible but not immediately visible. This is about answers, not confrontation if we can avoid it. We exited the car quietly, closing the doors with minimal sound, then moved into the forest, paralleling the road but remaining concealed among the trees. The going was slow. The undergrowth was thick in places, and we had to be careful about making noise that might alert whoever was in or near the sedan to our presence. As we drew closer to the bend in the road, I motioned for Isabella to stay low and move more cautiously. We crept forward until we could just make out the vehicle through the screen of pine branches and underbrush. It sat where we had seen it, apparently empty, though the tinted windows made it difficult to be certain. "I don't see anyone," Isabella whispered, her mouth close to my ear. I nodded, scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of movement or human presence. Nothing seemed out of place, no camping equipment, no footprints, no indication of what the car's owner might be doing in this isolated location. "We need to get closer," I decided reluctantly. "See if there's anything in or around the car that might tell us who we're dealing with." Isabella's hand gripped my arm. "Be careful," she said simply. I moved forward through the trees, staying as quiet as possible, every sense heightened to painful acuity. As I neared the edge of the forest where it met the gravel road, I caught a glimpse of something that made me freeze in place, a flash of color that didn't belong in the natural environment. About 20 yards beyond the sedan. Adjusting my position slightly, I could make out what appeared to be a path leading away from the road into the deeper forest. And near the entrance to that path, partially concealed by underbrush but still visible from my vantage point, was a mask. The same presidential mask that had haunted our nightmares, discarded carelessly as though its owner had removed it temporarily and set it aside. My heart hammering in my chest, I retreated to where Isabella waited. "The mask is there," I whispered urgently, "just beyond the car, and there's a path leading into the forest." Her eyes widened. "They're here then?" "Right now," I nodded. "But not in the car. They've gone somewhere on foot." We faced another decision point: follow the path, potentially encountering our watcher in some isolated area of the forest, or wait by the car, confronting them when they returned. Neither option seemed particularly safe or likely to provide the answers we sought. "Let's check the car first," Isabella suggested. "Maybe there's identification, something to tell us who we're dealing with." It was a reasonable suggestion, and I nodded agreement. We emerged from the forest cautiously, every step feeling like an exposure of vulnerability. The dark sedan sat silently on the gravel shoulder. No signs of life within or around it. As we approached, I realized the driver's window was partially open, perhaps an inch of space that might allow us to see the interior more clearly without actually breaking into the vehicle. Isabella reached it first, peering through the narrow opening. "There's something on the passenger seat," she reported, her voice barely audible. "Papers or photographs, I can't tell which." I joined her at the window, trying to angle my view to see what she was describing. The interior was dim due to the tinted windows, but I could make out what appeared to be a manila folder lying open on the passenger seat, its contents partially visible. "Photographs," I confirmed as my eyes adjusted to the low light. "And they look like—" I trailed off, a cold realization settling in my stomach like lead. Even from this limited vantage point, I could see enough of the photographs to recognize their subjects, Isabella and me, in various locations entering our apartment building, sitting at the cafe near Isabella's parents' house, even walking into the sheriff's office just days earlier. "They've been documenting us," I said, drawing back from the window. "Following us, photographing us. This isn't random. This is deliberate stalking." Isabella's face had gone pale, her earlier determination wavering in the face of this concrete evidence of our surveillance. "We need to get these to the police," she said. "This is proof." I nodded, looking around for anything we might use to gain entry to the locked vehicle without setting off an alarm. But before we could formulate a plan, a sound from further along the path caught our attention, the distinct crack of a branch breaking under weight, followed by rustling underbrush. Someone was coming back along the path. We retreated quickly, not back into the forest but to the opposite side of the road, positioning ourselves where we would be visible to whoever emerged, but not immediately within reach. I placed my hand on the knife at my belt, hoping desperately I wouldn't need to use it but unwilling to face our stalker completely defenseless. The rustling grew louder, branches moving aside as someone approached the road, and then suddenly, a figure emerged from the forest path. Tall, male, dressed in dark clothing that blended well with the surroundings. In one hand, he carried the presidential mask we had seen discarded by the path. For a moment, he didn't notice us, his attention on the mask as he brushed off some dirt or debris. Then, sensing our presence, he looked up sharply, freezing in place as he registered that he was not alone. The three of us stood in tableau, separated by the width of the gravel road, sizing each other up in tense silence. He was younger than I had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with close-cropped dark hair and an unremarkable face that would blend easily into any crowd. Nothing about his appearance suggested menace or madness, which somehow made the situation all the more unsettling. "Who are you?" Isabella broke the silence, her voice steadier than I would have thought possible given the circumstances. "Why have you been following us?" The man's expression shifted from surprise to something like resignation. He sighed, looking down at the mask in his hand as though it might offer some explanation or excuse. When he finally spoke, his voice was surprisingly ordinary, almost apologetic. "My name is Robert Carson," he said. "I'm a private investigator. Or I was until recently." Of all the responses I had imagined, this ranked among the least expected. A private investigator implied someone had hired him, that our surveillance had a purpose beyond random harassment or psychopathic obsession. "Who hired you?" I demanded, my hand still on the knife but my grip loosening slightly. "Why us?" Carson hesitated, seeming to weigh his options or perhaps the terms of whatever agreement bound him to his employer. "It's complicated," he said finally, "and not entirely what you're thinking." "Uncomplicated," Isabella said, her voice hardening. "Now, or we're calling the sheriff and reporting your car full of stalking evidence." The threat seemed to work. Carson nodded, gesturing toward a fallen log beside the road. "Can we sit? This isn't a short explanation." We approached cautiously, positioning ourselves on the log while Carson crouched on his haunches a few feet away, the mask now dangling loosely from one hand. For the first time, I noticed how tired he looked. Dark circles under his eyes, a gauntness to his features that suggested he hadn't been eating or sleeping well. "I was hired about 3 months ago," he began, "by a man named Victor Harlow. He wanted me to investigate disappearances in this area. Specifically, hikers and campers who had gone missing over the past few years." "Like Jonathan Wheeler," Isabella interjected. Carson looked surprised. "You know about Wheeler?" "We saw a missing person poster in our building," I explained. "He disappeared around the time we went camping here." Carson nodded. "Wheeler was the most recent, but there have been others. Not many, 1 or 2 a year, but enough to create a pattern if you know what to look for. Harlow's son was one of them, 2 years ago. The police investigation went nowhere, so he hired me to dig deeper." "What does any of this have to do with us?" Isabella asked, the confusion evident in her voice. "We're not missing. We just went camping." "You weren't supposed to be targets," Carson said, running a hand through his short hair in a gesture of frustration. "You weren't part of the pattern. Wrong demographic, wrong time of year. But you saw me." Understanding began to dawn. "In the tree," I said slowly. "That night at our campsite. You were watching for whatever takes these people, not watching us specifically." He nodded, grimacing. "I've been staking out potential sites, trying to identify what's happening to these hikers. The mask is..." He hesitated, looking embarrassed. "It's to avoid being recognized if someone spots me. People remember a mask more than a face." "But then you followed us back to the city," Isabella said, not yet ready to accept his explanation. "You left that drawing in our tent. You tried to break into our apartment." Carson's expression shifted to genuine confusion. "Drawing break-in? I followed you, yes, but only because you had seen me. I needed to know if you would report what you'd seen, if you might inadvertently compromise my investigation. But I never entered your tent, never left any drawing, never tried to break into your apartment." His denial seemed sincere, but it left us with more questions than answers. If not Carson, then who had been terrorizing us? Who had left the drawings? Who had attempted to enter our apartment? Who had tracked us to Isabella's hometown? "Show them," a new voice said from the direction of the forest path. All three of us turned sharply toward the sound. Standing where Carson had emerged minutes earlier was another figure, older with silver-streaked hair and the weathered face of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. He held something in his hand, a folder similar to the one we had glimpsed in the car. "Mr. Harlow," Carson acknowledged, his tone suggesting this unexpected appearance was not entirely welcome. "I was just explaining." "Not well enough," the older man interrupted, approaching our impromptu gathering with purposeful strides. He thrust the folder toward Isabella and me. "See for yourselves. Inside were photographs, not of us, as we had assumed when glimpsing similar material in the car, but of other people, hikers, campers, ordinary individuals engaged in outdoor activities. And more disturbing, photographs of what appeared to be crime scenes. Though not official police photographs, these had been taken surreptitiously, showing disturbed earth, unusual arrangements of stones, crude drawings similar to the ones we had received." "What is this?" I asked, looking up from the disturbing images. "Evidence," Harlow said grimly, "of a pattern that the authorities refuse to recognize. People disappear in these woods targeted by someone who watches them first, who leaves signs, stone stacks, drawings, masks placed where they'll be seen. It's a game to him, whatever he is." "Whatever?" Isabella repeated, picking up on the odd phrasing. Harlow's expression darkened. "I've been tracking these cases for 2 years since my son disappeared. The pattern goes back much further, decades possibly. Too long for any single human perpetrator. Either it's a learned behavior passed down or—" He trailed off, unwilling to voice whatever alternative he had considered. Carson cleared his throat, filling the uncomfortable silence. "What Mr. Harlow is trying to say is that we believe you inadvertently stumbled into an active hunting ground. When you saw me watching, doing surveillance, you became aware that something was wrong here. That made you potential witnesses, potential threats to whoever is really responsible for these disappearances." "The drawings," Isabella said slowly. "The masked figure on our fire escape. That wasn't you?" Carson shook his head emphatically. "As I said, I followed you briefly to ensure you weren't going to compromise the investigation, but I never approached you directly. The behavior you're describing, the escalating intimidation, that's consistent with the pattern we've documented in other cases. It's how he operates before people disappear." A cold realization washed over me. "You're saying we've been targeted by the actual kidnapper or killer, not by you? That we're being hunted?" Harlow nodded grimly. "And he followed you home, followed you to your girlfriend's parents' house. He doesn't give up once he's selected targets. That's why we're here now. Carson tracked your rental car back to this area. We figured you must have discovered some connection to this place and were returning to investigate, just as you were." The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture far more disturbing than our original assumption of being harassed by a random stalker. If Harlow and Carson were to be believed, we had unknowingly attracted the attention of someone responsible for multiple disappearances. Someone who had been terrorizing us not out of random malice, but as a prelude to something far worse. "What do we do now?" Isabella asked, her voice small but determined. "How do we stop this?" Harlow exchanged a look with Carson, some unspoken communication passing between them. "We were hoping you might help us," he said finally. "Set a trap, draw him out. With your cooperation and our experience tracking him, we might finally identify who's responsible for these disappearances." The proposal hung in the air between us, its implications both terrifying and compelling. To deliberately position ourselves as bait for a potential killer was madness by any rational standard. And yet the alternative, continuing to be hunted, never knowing when or where our tormentor might appear next, seemed equally unbearable. "We need time to think about this," I said after a long pause. "To discuss it privately." Harlow nodded, though his expression suggested he had hoped for immediate agreement. "Of course. We'll be at the main campsite clearing. Find us when you've decided." As they walked away, leaving Isabella and me alone with our thoughts, the forest around us seemed to press closer, its shadows deeper, its silence more complete. The decision before us was impossible. Risk everything on a dangerous plan with people we had just met and had no reason to trust fully, or return to our lives knowing that something was out there, watching, waiting, planning our disappearance. What do you think? Isabella asked when they were out of earshot. Do we trust them? Do we do this? I took her hand, feeling the slight tremor that ran through her despite her outward composure. I don't know if we can trust them entirely, I admitted. But their explanation makes sense of things that otherwise don't connect. And if they're right about the pattern, about us being targeted specifically now, then we're in danger no matter what, she finished for me. At least this way we'd be facing it directly with some kind of plan and with help. The decision crystallized between us without further words needed. Whatever happened next, we would face it together, would finally confront the Watcher who had transformed our lives into a waking nightmare. With renewed purpose, we stood and began walking toward the campsite clearing, toward whatever end awaited us in these woods where watching and being watched had become a deadly guest, and the campsite clearing looked different in the harsh light of our newer understanding, less a recreational space and more a stage, where a disturbing drama had played out multiple times before. As Isabella and I approached, Harlow and Carson were deep in conversation beside a folding table they had set up. Maps and photographs spread out before them like the evidence board of a police investigation. They looked up as we entered the clearing, their expressions a mixture of hope and wariness. You've decided? Harlow asked, his voice carefully neutral. I nodded, speaking for both of us. We'll help, but we need to know exactly what you're planning, what our roles would be, and what safeguards are in place if things go wrong. Carson gestured to the makeshift command center they had established. We've been tracking patterns of activity, times, locations, behaviors that precede disappearances. Based on our data, we believe we can predict with reasonable accuracy where and when our target is likely to appear if suitable. Incentives are provided. Incentives meaning us, Isabella clarified, her tone flat. Harlow had the grace to look uncomfortable. Not exactly. We need to recreate the conditions that typically attract his attention. Yes, but with controlled variables and backup plans in place. You wouldn't be alone or unprotected at any point. What exactly do you have in mind? I asked, approaching the table to examine their materials more closely. The plan they outlined was both simple in concept and alarmingly complex in execution. Isabella and I would establish a visible campsite in the area where previous disappearances had occurred, making ourselves appear to be typical recreational campers, while actually serving as part of an elaborately staged scenario. Carson would maintain his established observation post, the tree where we had first spotted him, while Harlow and two associates he had contacted would position themselves at strategic points around the perimeter, creating a surveillance net designed to identify anyone approaching the campsite. The goal isn't confrontation, Carson emphasized as he walked us through the details. It's identification. We need to know who we're dealing with, whether it's someone local, someone who lives in the forest itself, or something else entirely. Something else? Isabella questioned, picking up on the odd phrasing just as she had earlier. Harlow and Carson exchanged another of those meaningful glances that suggested conversations we hadn't been privy to, theories they weren't yet willing to share. There are aspects of these cases that resist conventional explanation, Harlow said carefully. Patterns of behavior that seem inconsistent with normal human psychology. I've explored various possibilities over the years, from cult activity to individuals with severe psychiatric disorders to less mainstream theories. The hesitation in his voice, the careful selection of words, suggested beliefs he was reluctant to articulate fully. I decided not to press the issue for now, focusing instead on the practical aspects of their proposal. How long would this operation take? I asked. And what happens if your target actually appears? We're not law enforcement. We can't make arrests or detain anyone. We've taken that into account, Carson assured us. Harlow's associates include a former state trooper who knows the proper procedures for citizens' detention if it comes to that. And we've prepared documentation, all the evidence we've gathered over the years, to hand over to authorities immediately if we identify a suspect. The plan had clearly been developing for some time, long before our involvement, which provided some reassurance that we weren't being manipulated into a hastily conceived trap. Still, significant questions remained about our personal safety and the legality of the entire operation. And if nothing happens? Isabella asked. If your target doesn't appear? Harlow's expression darkened momentarily. He'll appear. The pattern is consistent. Once he's identified potential victims, once he's begun the intimidation phase, which he clearly has with you, he always returns to complete the sequence. The certainty in his voice was chilling, a reminder that whatever game our watcher was playing, the stakes were literally life and death. After further discussion of logistics and contingency plans, Isabella and I reluctantly agreed to participate in the operation, scheduled to begin that evening. The next few hours passed in a flurry of preparation. Harlow's associates arrived, the former state trooper Michael Jenkins and a wilderness guide named Elaine Mercer, who knew the forest intimately. Both had personal connections to previous disappearances. Jenkins had been involved in the initial search for Harlow's son, while Mercer had lost a colleague to whatever or whoever was stalking these woods. As dusk approached, Isabella and I found ourselves establishing camp in a clearing about half a mile from where we had originally stayed, a location selected based on Harlow's analysis of previous incidents. We set up the tent, a new one provided by Carson, similar in appearance to our original but equipped with concealed cameras, built a small fire, and generally made ourselves visible while the others took their positions in the surrounding forest. "This is surreal," Isabella murmured as we sat beside the fire, maintaining our roles as ordinary campers while acutely aware of the observers hidden in the darkness beyond our clearing, both the ones there to protect us and, potentially, the one who had been terrorizing us for weeks. I nodded, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line despite knowing that Carson, Harlow, and the others were doing the same with greater experience and better equipment. "Do you think this will actually work? That will catch whoever's been watching us?" Isabella was quiet for a moment, her face golden in the firelight. "I don't know," she admitted finally, "but I'm tired of being afraid, of looking over my shoulder constantly. One way or another, I want this to end." The sentiment resonated deeply with me. Whatever happened tonight, success, failure, or something in between, we were taking action rather than simply reacting to the torment inflicted upon us. There was power in that, a reclaiming of agency that had been stolen when we first became targets. As the hours passed without incident, we maintained our charade of normalcy, eating a simple dinner, talking in hushed voices about inconsequential topics, occasionally feeding the fire to maintain its light and warmth. All the while our senses remained hyper-alert, attuned to every sound and movement in the forest around us. The communication devices provided by Carson, small, earpieces that allowed us to receive messages from the surveillance team without obviously responding, remained silent except for hourly check-ins, confirming that all positions were maintained and no suspicious activity had been observed. Around midnight, following the plan we had established, Isabella and I made a show of preparing for sleep, entering the tent and arranging our sleeping bags while leaving the small mesh window uncovered, a deliberate recreation of the conditions under which we had first noticed being watched. Inside the tent, lying side by side in artificial repose while remaining fully clothed and alert, we continued our whispered conversation, trying to distract ourselves from the tension that made every muscle ache with readiness. "What do you think Harlow meant about less mainstream theories?" Isabella asked, her voice barely audible. "The way he and Carson talk sometimes, it's almost like they think she didn't complete the thought, but she didn't need to." I had picked up on the same undercurrent in their discussions, a reluctance to commit fully to conventional explanations, hints of beliefs that strayed into territories most rational people would dismiss as superstition or paranoia. "I think grief can push people toward explanations that make sense of senseless losses," I offered. "Harlow lost his son. That kind of pain might make even the strangest theories seem plausible if they provide some framework for understanding why it happened." Isabella nodded, her face dimly visible in the minimal light filtering through the tent material. "But what if—" Her question was cut short by a soft tone in our earpieces, a signal we had established to indicate potential activity. We fell silent immediately, every sense straining for information while maintaining our appearance of sleep in case we were already under observation. "Movement at the northeast perimeter," Carson's voice whispered through the earpieces. "Single figure approaching slowly through the trees. Maintain positions and current activities." My heart rate accelerated sharply, and beside me I could feel Isabella's body tense despite her outward stillness. After weeks of fear and uncertainty, our watcher was apparently approaching, unaware of the trap that had been set. Minutes passed with excruciating slowness, the silence broken only by the occasional soft update from Carson or one of the others. The figure was still approaching, taking an indirect route that suggested caution or familiarity with surveillance techniques. They had not yet entered the clearing, but were moving systematically around its perimeter, perhaps assessing the situation before committing to a closer approach. "Possible mask observed," Jenkins reported, his voice tense with alertness. "Subject is wearing what appears to be a rubber presidential mask, consistent with previous descriptions." The confirmation sent a chill through my body despite the relative warmth inside the tent. This was no coincidence, no misunderstanding. The same masked figure who had terrorized us in the city, who had tracked us across hundreds of miles, was now circling our campsite, unaware of the surveillance operation closing in around them. "All units hold position," Harlow instructed. "Let them approach the tent. We need clear identification before moving in." Isabella's hand found mine in the darkness, her grip painfully tight but grounding. We maintained our facade of sleep, though every instinct screamed to run, to hide, to confront. Anything but this agonizing passivity while danger circled ever closer. The minutes stretched interminably until Carson's voice came through again, urgent and low. "Subject approaching tent directly from the west. Prepare for possible contact." I could hear it now. The soft crunch of pine needles under careful footsteps, the almost imperceptible rustle of fabric against underbrush. Our watcher was no longer circling but approaching directly with purpose. The certainty in his voice was chilling, a reminder that whatever game our watcher was playing, the stakes were literally life and death. After further discussion of logistics and contingency plans, Isabella and I reluctantly agreed to participate in the operation, scheduled to begin that evening. The next few hours passed in a flurry of preparation. Harlow's associates arrived, the former state trooper Michael Jenkins and a wilderness guide named Elaine Mercer, who knew the forest intimately. Both had personal connections to previous disappearances. Jenkins had been involved in the initial search for Harlow's son, while Mercer had lost a colleague to whatever or whoever was stalking these woods. As dusk approached, Isabella and I found ourselves establishing camp in a clearing about half a mile from where we had originally stayed, a location selected based on Harlow's analysis of previous incidents. We set up the tent, a new one provided by Carson, similar in appearance to our original but equipped with concealed cameras, built a small fire, and generally made ourselves visible while the others took their positions in the surrounding forest. "This is surreal," Isabella murmured as we sat beside the fire, maintaining our roles as ordinary campers while acutely aware of the observers hidden in the darkness beyond our clearing, both the ones there to protect us and, potentially, the one who had been terrorizing us for weeks. I nodded, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line despite knowing that Carson, Harlow, and the others were doing the same with greater experience and better equipment. "Do you think this will actually work? That will catch whoever's been watching us?" Isabella was quiet for a moment, her face golden in the firelight. "I don't know," she admitted finally, "but I'm tired of being afraid, of looking over my shoulder constantly. One way or another, I want this to end." The sentiment resonated deeply with me. Whatever happened tonight, success, failure, or something in between, we were taking action rather than simply reacting to the torment inflicted upon us. There was power in that, a reclaiming of agency that had been stolen when we first became targets. As the hours passed without incident, we maintained our charade of normalcy, eating a simple dinner, talking in hushed voices about inconsequential topics, occasionally feeding the fire to maintain its light and warmth. All the while our senses remained hyper-alert, attuned to every sound and movement in the forest around us. The communication devices provided by Carson, small, earpieces that allowed us to receive messages from the surveillance team without obviously responding, remained silent except for hourly check-ins, confirming that all positions were maintained and no suspicious activity had been observed. Around midnight, following the plan we had established, Isabella and I made a show of preparing for sleep, entering the tent and arranging our sleeping bags while leaving the small mesh window uncovered, a deliberate recreation of the conditions under which we had first noticed being watched. Inside the tent, lying side by side in artificial repose while remaining fully clothed and alert, we continued our whispered conversation, trying to distract ourselves from the tension that made every muscle ache with readiness. "What do you think Harlow meant about less mainstream theories?" Isabella asked, her voice barely audible. "The way he and Carson talk sometimes, it's almost like they think..." She didn't complete the thought, but she didn't need to. I had picked up on the same undercurrent in their discussions, a reluctance to commit fully to conventional explanations, hints of beliefs that strayed into territories most rational people would dismiss as superstition or paranoia. "I think grief can push people toward explanations that make sense of senseless losses," I offered. "Harlow lost his son. That kind of pain might make even the strangest theories seem plausible if they provide some framework for understanding why it happened." Isabella nodded, her face dimly visible in the minimal light filtering through the tent material. "But what if..." Her question was cut short by a soft tone in our earpieces, a signal we had established to indicate potential activity. We fell silent immediately, every sense straining for information while maintaining our appearance of sleep in case we were already under observation. "Movement at the northeast perimeter," Carson's voice whispered through the earpieces. "Single figure approaching slowly through the trees. Maintain positions and current activities." My heart rate accelerated sharply, and beside me I could feel Isabella's body tense despite her outward stillness. After weeks of fear and uncertainty, our watcher was apparently approaching, unaware of the trap that had been set. Minutes passed with excruciating slowness, the silence broken only by the occasional soft update from Carson or one of the others. The figure was still approaching, taking an indirect route that suggested caution or familiarity with surveillance techniques. They had not yet entered the clearing, but were moving systematically around its perimeter, perhaps assessing the situation before committing to a closer approach. "Possible mask observed," Jenkins reported, his voice tense with alertness. "Subject is wearing what appears to be a rubber presidential mask, consistent with previous descriptions." The confirmation sent a chill through my body despite the relative warmth inside the tent. This was no coincidence, no misunderstanding. The same masked figure who had terrorized us in the city, who had tracked us across hundreds of miles, was now circling our campsite, unaware of the surveillance operation closing in around them. "All units hold position," Harlow instructed. "Let them approach the tent. We need clear identification before moving in." Isabella's hand found mine in the darkness, her grip painfully tight but grounding. We maintained our facade of sleep, though every instinct screamed to run, to hide, to confront, anything but this agonizing passivity while danger circled ever closer. The minutes stretched interminably until Carson's voice came through again, urgent and low. "Subject approaching tent directly from the west. Prepare for possible contact." I could hear it now. The soft crunch of pine needles under careful footsteps, the almost imperceptible rustle of fabric against underbrush. Our watcher was no longer circling but approaching directly with purpose. A shadow fell across the mesh window of our tent, a dark silhouette blocking the minimal ambient light from the dying campfire. I felt rather than heard Isabella's sharp intake of breath, her body rigid beside mine as we both stared through barely opened eyes at the figure now clearly visible through the mesh. The presidential mask looked even more grotesque up close, its features distorted by the material and shadows into a parody of humanity. The figure remained motionless, simply observing us through the window, a spectator to our vulnerability. On my signal, Harlow whispered through the earpieces. 3, 2. Before he could complete the countdown, several things happened simultaneously. The masked figure suddenly straightened, head turning sharply as though alerted to danger. A branch snapped loudly somewhere in the darkness, and then chaos erupted as multiple voices shouted commands and flashlight beams cut through the night, converging on our tent from all directions. "Police!" "Don't move." The voices weren't those of our team, but unfamiliar, authoritative, actual law enforcement. In the confusion, I glimpsed the masked figure bolting away from the tent. disappearing into the darkness between the converging lights. Isabella and I scrambled out of the tent to find a scene of utter confusion. Local sheriff's deputies and state police officers ordering everyone to the ground. Harlow and his team trying to identify themselves while simultaneously pointing out the direction the masked figure had fled. "He's getting away," Harlow shouted, attempting to pursue despite the officer's commands. "That's him, the one responsible for the disappearances." In the chaos, Jenkins managed to explain our operation to one of the officers, who quickly redirected several deputies to pursue the fleeing suspect. The rest of us were detained at the campsite, our identities verified, our elaborate plan dissected under increasingly skeptical questioning. It emerged that Sheriff Wilson had become concerned after our visit to his office, conducting his own research into Harlow's activities and discovering the unauthorized surveillance operation being planned. Rather than directly confronting Harlow, he had monitored the situation and called in state resources when it became clear we were all returning to the forest. "You people were setting up a vigilante operation?" One state investigator admonished us as we sat by the rekindled campfire, surrounded by officers. "Whatever your intentions, that's not how investigations work in a society with laws." Harlow was defiant despite being handcuffed. "And how well have your official investigations worked? How many more people need to disappear before you acknowledge what's happening here?" The argument continued while search teams combed the surrounding forest for any sign of the masked figure. Hours passed with no success. Whoever had been watching us had escaped in the confusion, using their apparent familiarity with the terrain to evade even trained searchers with dogs and thermal imaging equipment. By dawn, the situation had reached an uneasy resolution. Harlow, Carson, and the others were being charged with various minor offenses related to their unauthorized surveillance operation, while Isabella and I were treated as cooperative witnesses rather than accomplices. The authorities had taken our statements about the harassment we had experienced, cataloging it as part of a larger investigation now being formally established. "We'll find whoever's been targeting you," Sheriff Wilson assured us as we prepared to leave, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine concern after seeing the evidence Harlow had accumulated. "But we'll do it legally with proper resources and procedures." The weeks following our return from the forest passed in a strange limbo of normalcy and lingering unease. We moved out of our apartment into a more secure building, with controlled access and security cameras. We filed restraining orders against an unidentified individual based on the evidence of stalking and harassment we had experienced. We attended therapy sessions to process the trauma of being targeted so systematically.